The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, you'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Hello folks, it's a dark and fairly cold September morning and you find me in the borough of Bedford for the very first time. I'm just waiting for the light to become light enough to start, and then we're going to have a walk around the first village here in Bedford. This is the very big and very beautiful Harrold. Harrold, Boundary Forest. Hello people of Bedford, welcome to the first of what will be a 49 video series covering the parishes of your borough, and I imagine it'll be a pretty interesting journey. Today we're kicking off the series with the lovely village of Harrold on the northern bank of the River Great Ouse. Harrold is a village that was once famed for its leather industry. In fact, it's thanks to this village that Lavenden, just down the road, has the honour now of hosting the Tustings factory, the luxury leather goods supplier. Harrold's name is a peculiar one. It has two different meanings, but the generally accepted version is Boundary Forest. The other is Grey Forest, but the former is more likely because the village sits close to the boundary of three counties: Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire and Northamptonshire. Harrold's neighbouring villages are of course Lavenden in Buckinghamshire, but it's also close to Bowseat in Northamptonshire, as well as Carlton and Chellington and Odell, all in Bedfordshire too. With Odell, it shares a huge country park, which used to be a sand and gravel quarry. In the Domesday Book, Harrold had 10 villagers. They would be shocked at the size of this place now. It has a heck of a lot to cover. There's a bridge, a priory, a lockup, a mill and countless pubs. One of the pubs is connected to Beatles legend Sir Paul McCartney. Let's learn how. Here we have Harrold Parish as it was in 1900. The village occupied then, as it still does today, the southeastern corner of the boundaries. The rest was, and still is to a large extent, farmland. The River Great Ouse forms the southern boundary. Harrold is an ancient village with few outlying hamlets. There were two of those though. One was called Folly to the north, lying on the western side of Odell Road. That's now connected to the main village and it's not really referred to as Folly anymore. The other was Santon, which has now been identified as a deserted medieval village and kiln complex through earthworks. It lies in the area of Santon Bar and the Slipe, near the border with Bowseat and Northamptonshire. Zoomed in a little, now we can see what Harrold had in these days. It wasn't a lot and it was all scrunched up into one main area, the High Street, running from east to west. There were very few offshoots, save for Brook Lane and Orchard Lane and the roads around the green. Using this map, I'll point out a few key areas of interest which are marked. First of all, in the south you can see the River Great Ouse. On its banks we have a corn mill and a church. The mill is no longer in use, but the church is still very much going. Also on the northern bank is Harrold Hall. That's gone now, replaced with a street called Hall Close. South of that is Harrold Bridge, which has provided a crossing point over the river here for centuries and still does today. Now look further west and you'll see the site of a priory marked here. That's in the wrong place. The priory was never there, but there is the outside possibility that the land might have been used or farmed by it at one time. We'll discover where the priory actually was on our walk. Around the green you can see the schools, plural because there were two. Those buildings are still there, but these days there's a newer school that the children go to, not a million miles away from them actually. To the west are the Congregational Chapel and the Mansion. Those are both important buildings which still stand. Now you'll note there are far more buildings all along the High Street, none of which are marked, but there are several of note along there that perhaps should be. And so here's how all of that compares to today. As you can see, Harrold has expanded greatly, mainly to the north of the High Street. In the last 200 years, Harrold's population has fluctuated by a few hundred either side of 1,000. The population, though larger in proportion to other Bedfordshire parishes now than it was at the time of Doomsday, is still not huge. In the 2001 census, Harrold was placed 54th out of the 124 civil parishes of Bedfordshire at that time. So our route around the place looks like this. We'll start in the new bit at a playground before coming down onto the High Street and turning left. That'll take us to the Odell Road, where we'll meet the cricket club and the entrance to the country park between the two villages. Then we'll go to Harrold Bridge and learn about that crossing point before heading up Hall Close, where Harrold Hall once stood, to the Church of St Peter. From there, we'll go back to the High Street, heading west to the Green. That section has most of Harrold's main landmarks. The Green will keep us busy too. On there, there's an old lockup, and overlooking it are the former schools and a chapel. At the foot of the Green is the lane that leads to the old mill, and we'll be sure to check that out before turning back on ourselves and using this path. That'll take us back to the High Street, where we'll head back east via the Mansion and the Congregational Chapel. There's also the Muntjac and the Oakley Arms in that section, which will also take us past an old tannery where leather was once produced. After that, we turn north up Brook Lane, passing the Harrold Centre and the site of the parish workhouse. From there, it's then a maze of footpaths and new build streets, but we'll make our way to Odell Road again and the fire station before using Mead Way to reach our endpoint, the surgery. Let's get this walk started with the playground on Harewells Way. It's a nice central location for such a park, and this is located within one of the newer residential areas of Harrold. On the old map, this simply did not exist. You don't have to go far to find the older bits of the village though. Directly south of Harewells Way, there's a linkway to the much older Dove Road, and that will take us onto the High Street, stretching from the parish boundary in the east through Harrold to Lavenden Road to the west. Harrold Cricket Club play on this field. They were formed in 1868. They've always been a progressive, inclusive and friendly club. ECB Club Mark accredited, they offer midweek and weekend cricket for all ages. They have both Saturday and Sunday sides competing in the Four Counties Cricket League, the Bedfordshire Invitational Cricket League and Bedfordshire County Cricket League. They also have two teams in the Bedford Midweek Cricket League. Harrold Cricket Club also provides an impressive junior cricket programme run by ECB qualified coaches with regular playing opportunities, providing a pathway to adult cricket. Others just like to play the game to meet new friends and enjoy the sound of leather on willow. I can't argue with that. Ah yes, the daylight has certainly come to me now. So for the rest of this episode, it shouldn't look quite so dreary and dark, which is a good thing. Now, we've made our way to Harrold Odell Country Park, which is mostly in Odell. There's a tiny little bit which is in Harrold. So for the most part, this will feature in tomorrow's episode, but we will make a mention of it here. Not far away from the cricket ground is an entrance to Harrold Odell Country Park. Now, the boundary between Harrold and Odell is the road here, so most of this park is actually in Odell. We'll cover this more in tomorrow's episode, therefore. A quick word for it here though. It's a 59.3 hectare country park and local nature reserve between the two villages, owned and managed by Bedford Borough Council. It has a cafe, toilets and an information room, and it's easily accessible from Harrold. Let's move on to Harrold Bridge. This is the 14th century Harrold Bridge, which spans the River Great-Ouse. It's sometimes known alternatively as the Great River Bridge. As bridges go, this one's a little unusual because it's not just about what crosses the river here, you have to consider the road on the other side too. The main bridge has 6 arches and stretches for some 213 feet. That's followed by a 49-foot causeway for traffic on the southern side before you then cross a series of 9 flood arches running for another 197 feet. Pedestrians are catered for too here. There's a foot causeway that does the same job, protecting you from floods, which runs parallel to the road. These arches are needed because the river regularly floods in these parts. The bridge is quite narrow and traffic only flows over it one way at a time, a process that's governed by a set of traffic lights at each end. The bridge sits on a parish boundary, marked by the river. Directly to the south is the village of Carlton. To get into Harrold this morning, I drove over this bridge from my hotel in Bedford, and let me tell you, that is a lot narrower than it looks on the camera. It looks quite wide there, doesn't it? But trust me, it's not. It is a bit of a scary thing to try and do, especially in the dark. Okay, so now we're going to turn around and head back from whence we came. The country park you can see on the right hand side just there, but we're not interested in that. That's going to be mainly covered tomorrow. Instead, we're going that way along Hall Close. After turning around at the bridge, next we come to Hall Close. This is the site of the former Harrold Hall, built by Francis Farrer between 1608 and 1610. He was the eldest son of Rafe Farrer, the London grocer we talked about in Cold Brayfield. Harrold Hall was built on the site of a former priory, the old buildings of which Rafe Farrer had bought in 1558. On the old map you saw at the start of this video, the site of the priory is marked in the wrong place. For many years, people believed that it stood in the west of the village, and there were differing ideas as to its exact position. The map shows it was near the modern school. However, recent research has shown the priory once lay next to the church, which Hall Close does today. Backing that up, medieval tombstones, which would have been used for nuns, were found in the grounds of the hall. What happened to the monastic buildings is unclear. Some say they were adapted by Francis Farrer and formed part of the hall. Certainly the stone would have been reused. As for Harrold Hall, that had 3 stories and was built in a common E-shape, with the front facing south towards the River Great-Ouse. After Francis Farrer's death in 1616, the house passed to his son-in-law, Sir Thomas Bottler. It was later sold to Anne Joliffe, and via her it came to the Alston family. The Alstons opted to not live in it much and generally leased it out. They held onto it for 2 centuries, finally parting ways with it in 1938. It was then left uninhabited and became a barracks for the Pioneer Corps during World War II. After a small time as a private residence after the war, the hall was destroyed thanks to an act of vandalism in 1961. The site of the house and its grounds were then developed into Hall Close, this cul-de-sac of unexceptional executive homes. So there might not be a priory anymore, but there is a wonderful church and it's dedicated to St Peter. It's built of coursed limestone rubble. Now it seems reasonable to assume that there was a church here in Anglo-Saxon times, though the first mention of a vicar is from about 1200. The church formed part of the original endowment of the priory, thereby reducing the status of the parish incumbent from rector to vicar. That was retained by the priory until 1536, when it was suppressed by King Henry VIII. There is some debate about the earliest part of this church. Sir Nicholas Pevsner, in his Buildings of England volume for Bedfordshire, states that the earliest identifiable part of the current church building is the north aisle, but the north wall of the nave may contain Anglo-Saxon work. The chancel and south aisle were built during the 13th century. The tower and the spire date from the 14th century, being in the decorated style, with the clerestory being a later addition to allow more light into the building. It was added in the 15th century. This church contains memorials of the families of Boteler and Alston, a monument for Anna Joliffe, and the tomb of Anne Mead, the daughter of Sir Roland Alston of Odell and wife of Dr. Richard Mead, the celebrated physician. There isn't much in the way of stained glass here. In the north wall of the north chapel is a small panel depicting St Crispin and St Crispinian. These are the patron saints of cobblers, tanners and leatherworkers. This illustrates what was an important industry in the area until the 1970s. Okay, so once past the church, we're then on this road here, which leads to Harrold Main Street, which you've already seen once in the dark, and now it'll be light again. Now when we get to the main street, we're going to be taking on two pubs. They're both former pubs, they're not in business anymore. Harrold does have a pub or two though, as you'll see later, but it used to have a lot more than what it currently does. Now, Harrold has had several pubs throughout the centuries. Some are still in business, others very much not so. Here's one that closed a long time ago. This is the former Wheatsheaf, which used to be known alternatively as the New Inn. Although impossible to date accurately, the first mention of this in any sort of record was in 1751 when the Kempton family sold or conveyed the property to Thomas Glover. It appears in sales records again in 1786 when Richard Clapham was the innholder. John Rawlins, a wine merchant from Bedford, had taken over by 1836. He pulled down the old Wheatsheaf and built today's structure. This may account for the date of around 1830 referred to in an 1876 licensing return. This version of the Wheatsheaf was also an excise office in the 19th century. As a pub, it had a tap room, a private bar, a private room, a scullery, a larder, a club room, a dining room and a cellar on the ground level. Upstairs were 7 bedrooms and a drawing room, as well as 2 letting rooms. By the 1920s, it was all in the hands of Biggleswade brewers Wells and Winch before they were taken over by Greene King in 1961. The Wheatsheaf closed in 1974 and it's now a substantial private house. This building at number 54 High Street is another former pub. Today it's a restaurant called Spices of Paradise, but this has had quite a storied past. Most of the locals will remember this as the Magpie, but it's had a couple of different guises. It's known for sure that in 1834 it was called the Berkeley Arms, thanks to a record of it going to auction in that year. The description given of the pub in that record ties in very nicely with another of the Magpie in 1927, which this eventually became. It's possible, but not known for sure, that in the 19th century this was a pub called the Bull. For a number of years, people have speculated where the Bull was in Harrold, and there are theories and ideas that it and the Magpie might have been one and the same thing. It's known for sure that both lay adjacent to a bakery. In 1884, the Bull's Yard and outbuildings were used as part of a bakehouse, and in 1927, the Magpie was next door to a bakery in the occupation of Ernest J. Watts. This is not in any way conclusive though, and the Bull still may have been elsewhere. By August 2012, the pub was closed and for sale, and since then it's become Spices of Paradise, an Indian restaurant that's pretty popular with the locals. The reviews of it online certainly attest to that. Harrold has a small collection of shops and businesses, the main one these days being this co-op store on the end of Roman Paddock. Just next to this there's a hairdresser's, and further up the street there used to be a place called The Retreat, which was a health, beauty and well-being centre. Speaking of businesses, this next building is very unusual. It's a chippy with the rather imaginative title of Oh My Cod. Fish puns, eh? They certainly have a time and a place. Anyway, this has been a chippy for a few years, but what do you think this was in a previous life? Well, there are some clues. Firstly, take a look at the wide patch of concrete in front of this building. Does that tell you anything? If not, look above the shop's entrance and you'll see an old sign that says Arndale. Arndale were formerly known as Anglo, and they sold fuel. Yes, believe it or not, this used to be a garage. The concrete pad at the front was a forecourt and it had petrol pumps on it. There's no fuel here these days unless you count the food they serve up in the chippy. The place used to be known as Harrold Green Garage. Okay, so opposite the old garage, or Oh My Cod if you like, brilliant name by the way, you'll find this parish notice board. Now, people in Bedford, you will never have seen me before because this is the first episode I've done in your borough. When I come across a parish notice board, I leave one of these cards. Now this is one of those awful boards that doesn't open, so I've got to try and put it in somehow at the bottom. These are awkward, these. I'll just slot it there and hopefully someone will find it at a later date. Next we have the Baptist Church, which stands on the site of another former pub. They must have liked to drink in Harrold. The pub in question was called the George, which was in existence between 1816 and 1864. It's not clear when it first opened, or indeed when it finally closed. The fate of the George was rather unusual. It remained a drinking establishment for a short time because it became the British Workman. It sold drinks, yes, but ones that were totally non-intoxicating. It wasn't very successful. After it closed, the building was eventually pulled down and a very handsome temperance hall or mission room was erected in its place. That's this. It was built in 1876 by a Miss St. Quentin who lived next door. The mission was described as unsectarian and was later known as the Harrold Evangelical Church. It was licensed for marriages in 1889. For some 35 years, the church was ministered by Pastor Croxford, who lived at Rose Cottage, number 60 High Street. And now this is the Grace Baptist Church. It was formed in 1994 when Harrold Evangelical Church amalgamated with the Baptist Church in Carlton, choosing to occupy the old mission hall. We'll see the Carlton Baptist Church in a later video. On the green we come now to a pair of schools. These are the old national schools, one each for mixed juniors and infants. They officially opened in 1849, although they were in business from 1847, when their construction was finished. "12 years later, it was decided that the schools were too small and needed to be expanded. By 1863, a new schoolroom had been built, allowing accommodation for 172 boys and girls and 42 infants. Harrold was never a board school. As a former national, it became a public elementary. In 1937, after several building inspections which were quite damning, this closed and was replaced by a new school. Part of the old school buildings would go on to be used as a meeting room for the St. Francis Xavier Roman Catholic Church. This is where things might get a bit confusing. Replacing the old school initially was Harrold Junior Council School, which became Harrold County Primary in 1946. This changed again in the 1970s when Bedfordshire County Council introduced comprehensive education. That did away with the 11+ exam and grammar schools and introduced a new tier of school between the old county primary and county secondary schools. Thus, lower schools taught children aged 4 to 9, middle schools dealt with ages 9 to 13, and upper schools had age 13 upwards. So here's the confusing bit. Harrold County Primary School became Harrold Lower School, but the village also had an array of others. Harrold Priory County Secondary Modern School was one of them. That was to become Priory Middle School, and it stood adjacent to the lower school. See what I mean? Confusing. All you really need to know now, though, is that Harrold's only school is this, Harrold Primary Academy. This opened in September 2017, catering for the full range of primary age pupils, i.e. 4 to 11. It sits on the site of the old Harrold Lower and Harrold Priory Middle Schools. Now, whilst covering the chapel and the schools there, I've been purposely avoiding the green because this deserves its own section in itself. The green is an absolutely magnificent part of Harrold. If you drive through this place, you can't fail to miss the thing because it's so big and there's so many decent things on it to have a look at, including the War Memorial, which is not in shot right now, but it's there on the corner in front of the chapel. Here's the village green, easily one of the most attractive parts of Harrold today. This green was the centre of life in the place at one time, and as such, it's where a market was held every Thursday. It was granted to the village in a charter at the beginning of the 17th century. It later dwindled away, attended by only 1 or 2 butchers at its eventual death. In addition to the market, Harrold also held 3 yearly fairs. These were on the Tuesdays before the 13th of May, the 6th of July and the 11th of October. Overlooking the green is the market house built by the Duke of Kent at some point between 1702 and 1740. For a large part of the 19th century, the market house was not in the best of states, but since 1952 it's had a Grade 2 listing. There's another building of note on this green too, by the way. This is the lockup, built in 1825 by a former village constable. It was used for the temporary imprisonment of offenders until they were taken to court. By the turn of the 20th century, it was mostly used for storing lamps and oil. The last time this held a human was in 1967, although the person in question hadn't committed a crime. In fact, they profited from being inside it. It was a local character who won a bet by remaining inside it for 48 hours. I can't imagine it would have been comfortable in there for 2 days. Down the side of the green is a road that leads to the river. It's called Mill Lane, and the reason for that is because there used to be a watermill on the Ouse here in Harrold. There's been a mill in the village since at least the time of Doomsday, in fact. It was usually the case that any mills mentioned in the book were in the same ownership as the manor, and that was the case in Harrold until the 17th century. Here, there were 2 mills, both under the same roof. Remember the Perry family in Lavendon? Well, they were active millers here too. In 1617, John Perry operated this mill before Sir Thomas Bottler came along and pulled it down. It was re-erected by William Bottler, but not greatly successfully, as it caused flooding. The mill ceased to operate at some point during World War I. Certainly in 1919, Harrold Mill was noted as not working, or at least not for corn milling. It became a sort of power station providing electricity for an estate. In 1976, the mill building was renovated and altered to form a home. So this area where I'm standing here is still part of the green. It kind of loops around this bend of the Ouse here. And it's kind of a hidden gem. If you walk down here, this is what you find. Brilliant view of the Ouse coming through the archway there. Great sound. I love the sound of rushing water. And you can't see this on the map. So this was a bit of a treat, to be honest with you. Now we're on a footpath that runs around the back of the school's playing fields. It's within the playing fields where the 1900 map marks the site of Harrold Priory. We know different now, of course, because it was near the church. However, it's not inconceivable that the priory's lands extended this far west. There could have been a grange or a farm here tied to it. Harrold Priory was founded in 1138. It was a small, poor convent of Augustinian nuns. The nuns blamed their poverty partly on being close to a main road. They were therefore obliged to provide food and lodgings for travellers. They also had issues with the river. Periodic flooding damaged the priory buildings. This all suggests that the priory could well have had some land here, now underneath the school grounds. It would have been much easier to farm with no fear of flooding, that's for sure. The true extent of the priory will never be known, though. Now, as well as the school's playing field, there were some ideas that suggested this next house was a former priory site as well. This is the mansion, which dates back to at least 1619. That's the date given on its central chimney stack. It is, though, likely older. In the early 17th century, Thomas Dudley is believed to have lived in this house, although nobody is totally sure of that. What is known is that he sold property in Harrold to the Marston family, which was later bought by Edward Reynolds, the Bishop of Norwich. As well as owning the mansion, the Reynolds family owned Carlton Hall and a large estate in Pavenham. At some point, the Earl of Hardwicke purchased the mansion house and farms from Edward Reynolds. This was probably in 1764. The Congregational Church now, which these days is better described as the United Reformed Church. This is 200 years old, the first chapel having opened in 1808. The history of independent nonconformity in the village, however, can be traced back further to around 1720. You'll note there are two buildings here. In 1809, a congregational chapel was registered by Thomas Kilpin, Richard Hensman and Benjamin Allen, but that's not the building which stands today in the High Street. It was on this site, though. By 1836, the old chapel was no longer adequate for its growing congregation, and so it was replaced by a larger building. Again, this was enlarged later, and there's a plaque on this building commemorating that enlargement in 1863. So what's the other building then? Well, that's a Sunday school, and it was built in 1899. It was constructed on land given by Earl Cowper. It consisted of 4 classrooms, a vestry and a kitchen, all costing £620. It was opened on the 24th of May, 1900. Now, if you were watching my adventures in Lavenden at the weekend just gone, you'll already know about this next bit, because Harrold is quite famous for tanning leather. It had tanneries all over the place, and as we know, Tustings were founded in this village and moved to Lavenden. We saw their factory, didn't we? So where exactly were they based? Well, you don't have to go very far from the chapel to find out. Literally over the road was the site of one of Harrold's tanneries. Opposite the chapel is the site of Harrold's old tannery. Harrold has long been associated with the leatherworking industry, and as we know from this past weekend, it was the founding place of Tustings, the luxury leather goods company now in Lavenden. Harrold had lots of leatherworks, not just this one, but this was the biggest in the early 20th century, behind the southern part of the high street. It had machinery that included a 24 horsepower steam engine with a 13 feet by 2 inch main shaft. The leather dressing industry was established in Harrold in the 19th century by Edward Rate. It was aided by the large supplies of water from the River Ouse, which also conveniently carried away waste effluent. Harrold's leather supplied the shoe industry of Northamptonshire. Rate's tannery was in Orchard Lane at the junction of the road leading up to Buildings Farm. A house now stands on that site. There he had tan and lime pits where hides and skins were put in to fetch off the hair and wool. These were the only tan pits to be in Harrold. The hides and skins which afterwards came into the village were mostly from India, Nigeria, Australia and the Middle East, but they had already been tanned and only needed dressing and dyeing. Then the next factory to dress leather was Partridge's, which was opposite Mansion Lane. That burnt down in the late 1800s, and a house is now built on that site too. Now as for this was Billy Manton's factory, which was taken over by Jack Tusting. He formed the Eagle Works Company and greatly enlarged this small factory. It eventually became the Harrold Leather Company. Harrold's industrial sites became housing developments. Priory Close, Dickens Close and Eagle Way all stand on sites that were once industrial. It's all a marked difference from the days when tanning leather was a way of life in Bedfordshire. Just up the street we have the Muntjac, finally a public house that's actually open. This was formerly known as the Globe and was first licensed in 1845. By 1891, its owners were Hipwell and Company of Olney. The premises once comprised a small bar, a tap room, a living room and a cellar. Upstairs were a club room and 3 bedrooms, whilst outside there was a barn, a coach house, 2 stalls for stores, a hen house and a small garden. Because of the out-county ownership of the Globe down the years, the Bedfordshire and Luton Archives and Record Service doesn't have many records for it. In 2003, the name was changed to the Muntjac, and it's now a free house. Now, a lot of the information in this video has come from a website called the Bedfordshire Archives, which is absolutely brilliant if you want to research anywhere in Bedfordshire, really. And according to that website, this building over the road from the Muntjac, which is currently Harrold Butchers, that used to be another pub as well at one time. Here's another pub that's still going strong. This is the Oakley Arms, which used to be known as the Blacksmith's Arms many years ago. It's 19th century, but it's made of limestone rubble, giving it the same appearance as many of the oldest buildings in Harrold. When it was renamed is not exactly clear, but records have it as the Blacksmith's Arms in 1901. It changed its name at some point between the tenancies of Richard Wright and George Daniel Orpin in 1919. The row of thatched cottages leading west along the high street here never used to be part of this pub, although they are today, evidently. The row, which has its own Grade 2 listing, is much older than the Oakley pub itself, built of coarse limestone rubble and thatched roofs. Now, this pub is perhaps the most notable of all in Harrold because it has a claim to fame. It's believed that in 1968, Sir Paul McCartney played the first ever live rendition of the hit Beatles song Hey Jude in this very pub. Next, we have the Harrold Centre, which is, in effect, the village hall. This was originally the Harrold Institute, built in 1902 and funded by Charles James Pettit, the former leather factory proprietor of Harrold House. Pettit was a Congregationalist and handed the property over to the Congregational Union of England and Wales, who acted as its trustees from around 1914 to around 1970. After that time, the running of the institute was taken over by a local committee. The Institute Hall, which is next door, was built in 1911, again at the sole cost of Pettit. At the time of its opening, various activities took place here, including lace making and leather dressing. Well, that makes sense. Pettit was a leatherman. Nowadays, with no tanneries here, the Institute has several other purposes. Part of the building serves as a private flat. Snooker is played on the premises, and on the sporting theme, tennis is also played here on the courts behind the building. A local playgroup meet in the hall regularly. Now, this next thing concerns Brook Lane, which used to be called Water Lane for an obvious reason. Walk up here and on the left-hand side you'll see a brook, which commonly has water in it. This street is all residential these days, but people once knew this for what used to stand on it. In 1768, records show there was a poorhouse or a workhouse up here, which abutted a house to the west that would go on to be another pub called the Red Lion. Nobody is sure exactly where these things were, but there is a theory. In 1928, an article in the Bedfordshire Times stated that the old workhouse was said by locals to have stood on a site occupied by Clark's boot tree factory. If so, that places it and the Red Lion immediately to the south of numbers 54 and 56 Brook Lane. Now we're heading east again via a series of paths and streets that form a bit of a rat maze in Harrold's northernmost areas. After navigating this area, we'll be on a path that runs to the south of a huge lake adjacent to the Odell Road. See you again shortly. After walking the length of that path, we're now on Odell Road, and that means we have the fire station to cover next. There's not really much to say about this one. It's a simple little station covering Harrold and serving the surrounding villages. It goes by the name of Harrold Community Fire Station and is staffed by on-call firefighters, all of whom live or work within 5 minutes of this building. From here, we head south again and into another residential area, this time Meadway. Quite the village, this, people. I've been going for nearly 2 hours. It's almost 8 o'clock, so that shows you how big Harrold is. This is the biggest one I'll be doing today, though, so all the others should be, relatively simple in comparison. We're not quite finished with this one just yet. I'm walking along Meadway here, which will take us to the surgery, and then we'll head back round to the park where we started. You'll be able to see it in the daylight. And our last stop is the surgery, Harrold Medical Practice on Peaches Close. Again, not a lot to say about this really. It was built with the estate it sits in, and it serves the entire village. You can't ask for a lot more. One final bit of housing between here and the end, and we'll be back to the park. Alright, just under 2 hours later, here is the playground in the daylight. There you go. Looks a bit different in the dark, didn't it? But that's it. That's Harrold. Time to move on to the next one. It's a good way to start a run and a good way to start a Saturday morning. I tell you what, it ain't half blown some cobwebs off. So to finish with, we take a short drive up the eastern parish boundary before turning right into the next one. Far, far smaller than this place, the next one will see us fill in some more about that country park. We'll also meet a fabulous old watermill. See you tomorrow. Hello folks, welcome back to Bedford again for episode number 2. Now this one won't be anywhere near as big as Harrold was yesterday. This is a much smaller village, but it's no less important historically. This has a church, which is fabulous, and opposite that church there's a castle, although it's not a medieval castle, as we will discover. This is Odell. Odell, Woad Hill. Today in Bedford we come to the small village of Odell, located in the valley of the River Greatouse, about 10 miles away from Bedford itself. This might only be a small one, but Odell's history runs really deep. You wouldn't think that just by looking at it though. The name Odell is a corruption of woad hill, woad being a plant that was cultivated for its blue dye. We learned about that back in the Fenland series. Woad was here in abundance in Saxon times. Odell appears to be a quite sleepy little place with not a lot to it, but you'd be wrong. If you live in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, you'll be interested in this one. In 1635, Reverend Peter Bulkley of Odell rebelled against established church rule under Archbishop Laud. He would then lead his congregation on a voyage to America, where they founded the town. Walter the Fleming, a follower of William the Conqueror, was granted the lordship of Odell in 1086, and it was his ancestors who built Odell Castle. The castle was rebuilt as a manor in the mid-17th century, but that building too is now history. It burned down in 1931 to be replaced with a modern house, which today is home to the present Lord Luke of Pavenham. For many years, much of the village was owned by Lord Luke, and as such, many of the villagers worked for him. Let's go and find that house and fill in the rest. Here we have Odell as it was in 1900. It lies in the valley of the River Greatouse, which forms the southern boundary of the parish. Most of the land here is and was arable, mostly used for the growing of wheat. 904.25 acres were permanent grassland. Along the river, the average height above sea level is 145 feet. The church stands at just over 200 feet at the top of a hill, but the highest point of the village is marked by Hobbs Green Farm at just over 290 feet. The land gently rises as one goes north towards Santa Pod Raceway. Odell is an ancient parish bordered by Poddington to the northwest, Sharnbrook to the northeast and east, Felmersham to the southeast, Carlton and Chellington to the south, and Harrold to the southwest. The hamlet of Little Odell in the west is against the boundary with Harrold. Let's zoom in and take a look at what was here 125 years ago. Straight away your eyes are drawn to the east, where you can see the words Odell Castle on the site of a castle. Yes indeed, that is the case, and that will make sense as we walk around this place, I promise. This map also shows the location of the church on the hilltop right next to the castle's former site. Then if you look to the middle of the image here, you can see the letters PH on the widest part of the road. That's the Bell Inn public house, the only pub in the village these days. The wide area is the green, and that's been the centre of Odell for many a long year. Slightly east of the green you can see a corn mill at the point where the Ouse almost touches Odell. Then if you look further west, the school is marked on the road to Little Odell. It's still there, but it's no longer a school. Finally, you can see Little Odell to the extreme west, where there was once another pub called the Mad Dog. That's no longer trading. Aside from these, Odell was mostly residential, clustered mainly around the green, with a few outlying areas to the east and west. Not much has changed since. On the modern map you can see there are some bits of infill here and there and a couple of newer streets like the Tannery in the northeast, but essentially the shape and the layout of the village is the same. So, how are we going to walk around this one? Well, we'll begin by driving through the hamlet of Little Odell and checking out the Mad Dog before making our way to the Tannery to get things going on foot. From there we'll head downhill past the church and the site of Odell Castle. That will take us around a couple of bends. Following that, we'll go for the straight bit of road that leads to the old school before using a path which links you to Odell's play area at the end of Horsefair Green. We'll then return to the middle of the village to check out the Green and the Bell before ending up at the mill. From there, it'll be a walk back up the hill to the start. A fairly easy route, all things considered. Before we can get into the village though, we have to fill in the rest of the information about Harrold Odell Country Park, which we fleetingly visited yesterday. The vast majority of this park lies within Odell and so belongs to this episode, despite the fact that you have to drive through Harrold to get to its main entrance. Before this country park existed, this was all farmland, and the maps we saw earlier prove that fact. Shortly before World War II, it was turned into a massive sand and gravel quarry, and that mineral extraction continued until well after the war. Once all the mineral extraction here had finished, the area was restored to farmland, but the lakes were added to infill the pits left behind by quarrying. The lakes rapidly became important for wildlife, and soon after the establishment of them, the area was acquired by Bedfordshire County Council for use as a country park. That was in the 1980s. The park runs to some 114 acres in total. The days of quarrying are over, but this land still sees a lot of use. This whole area of northern Bedfordshire is of great archaeological importance, and the country park can be included within that. The entire river valley in which this sits has been occupied by humans since prehistoric times. So why am I mentioning that here? Let's go back to the Iron Age. Before anything had been quarried, there were a series of excavations. They uncovered the remains of an Iron Age farm dating back to the 1st century AD. They also turned up some evidence of a Roman settlement. Both of those things now lie under the lakes. The Iron Age farmstead occupied a site below the water of Grebe Lake between the visitors centre and the island in the middle of it. It would have featured a series of circular buildings that formed a farm surrounded by a 20-hectare fenced enclosure protected by a ditch. The occupants were probably an extended family of about 20 people who lived off cereal crops and animals that likely included cattle, sheep, pigs and horses. Although they were near the river, they drew their water from carefully prepared wells. When the site was excavated in the mid-1970s, archaeologists also found a number of wells with stone linings. These wells penetrated the water table to a depth of up to 2 meters, which is approximately 6 feet. Some were lined with wicker basket work, which formed a crude sort of filter. And you can bet that there were human remains found too, lots of them. There were several burial sites uncovered. The earliest graves lay in small cemeteries where whole pots were buried alongside bags containing cremated remains. It's unusual to find burials and cremations on the same site. Now, this might be a bit of deja vu, but because the entrance to the park is via Carlton Road in Harrold, to get to Odell we have to drive up that and turn right at Folly. You will have seen me do this yesterday at the end of that video. This time we're going a bit further. When you take that right turn towards Odell, the first place you come to is a small hamlet with the name Little Odell. On entering the place, the first thing you come to on the left is a former pub, the Mad Dog. Woof woof. I have to admit, when I learned there was a pub called the Mad Dog in Little Odell, I was actually laughing to myself because I've got a friend called Mark whose nickname is Mad Dog. Anyway, this is the Mad Dog pub. This is Little Odell's one and only building of note. The Mad Dog is otherwise known as 212 High Street, and it carries a Grade 2 listing these days. It's a late 17th or early 18th century building, constructed, like most of that age in the area, of limestone rubble. It has a thatched roof, and the building is of an L-shaped plan with a rear wing. The Colemans were landlords here for a number of years, and they ran a wheelwright and carpenter's business from the back of the house at one time. So how did it get its rather strange name, the Mad Dog? Well, this is a story that's often repeated with variations, so there's no way of knowing which is right. It's said that its first ever licensee had a recipe for the bite of a mad dog and named his establishment accordingly. Certainly, a Mad Dog recipe was owned by a Thomas Wells when he advertised it in the Northampton Mercury, noting that it came from William Hartwell. Thomas Wells was once the landlord, and therefore it seems likely that it was he who established it and its name in 1831. The Mad Dog is no older than that date, because the only other licensed premises in Odell between the years 1822 and 1828 was the Bell. That's in Odell itself. The Mad Dog started life as a beer house, but later became a fully fledged pub in the 20th century. Long since closed, it's now a private house. So from the Mad Dog, it's a simple enough drive into Odell, via of course the rest of Little Odell. The hamlet is otherwise all residential and doesn't have a lot to tell us. Odell Village though has plenty, as we're about to find out. Our walk starts on a cul-de-sac called the Tannery, which is a clue as to Odell's industrial past. As we know from yesterday, Harrold was a really important place when it came to tanning leather. It's not totally inconceivable, therefore, that Odell, as its neighbour, had a hand in that. That said, I didn't find any conclusive evidence that this street sits on or close to an old tannery, but there's always a clue in a name. I'd say it's highly likely leather was once produced here, even if it was just a small quantity. Here we have the Church of All Saints, which sits proudly on the top of the hill at this end of Odell. This is a 15th century gem of a church built in the Perpendicular style. The present building is built on the site of an older church that dated back to the early 13th century. The interior boasts an excellent 15th century rood screen and a memorial to Lieutenant Richmond, who died while flying the ill-fated R-101 airship on its fatal voyage over France in 1930. Whilst that is rightfully interesting, people know this church more for its western door. The door shows indentations, which folklore would have you believe are the devil's fingerprints. The story goes that the devil wanted to get his hands on the wicked Sir Roland Alston, he of the Alston family we talked a little bit about yesterday. After being chased down, Sir Roland escaped to sanctuary in the church, but the devil was having none of that. Legend says he gripped the tower and shook it in a blinding rage, leaving the marks of his fingers behind on the door. That's what you can see now, apparently. If you live in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, you'll be interested in this church. In 1635, Reverend Peter Bulkeley left this behind when he rebelled against the established church rule under Archbishop Laud. He would then lead his congregation on a voyage to America. He travelled on a ship called the Susan and Ellen, eventually arriving in Massachusetts, where he was ordained at Cambridge in 1637. He became the first minister of Musketaquid, which was later renamed Concord. He never came back to England, and today he's buried in Concord. Now, the church is great and all, but the thing that sets Odell apart from other villages around here is the fact that it once had a castle. In fact, it still does have a castle, but it's not medieval. The castle in question is over here. You can see there's a big mound opposite the end of the church entrance. Let's talk a bit about this and discover exactly what this is. Literally a few paces away from the church we have Odell Castle. Now, don't be fooled by the name, there is no castle here. Well, not anymore. There used to be. What little remains of the castle stands beside the church on high ground above the village green. This is just a house with the name. Odell Castle was built by Walter Flandrensis, or Walter the Fleming. He was a Norman adherent of William the Conqueror, who granted large tracts of land to him, including the manor of Wachel, which we know today as Odell. So Walter settled here and called himself the Baron of Wachel. That was to be the beginning of the Odell barony, and the castle was its seat. After establishing the castle, Walter's family lived here for some 400 years before the title died with a succession of female heirs. Odell Castle fell into disrepair and finally disintegrated into ruins. There are no illustrations of it which survive, although an early reference does, dating from the late 1180s. It mentions a fire at Odell Hall, which would have been the castle. That fire has a legend attached to it, but whether you believe what it suggests is totally up to you. According to the legend, Walter had an attractive daughter whose hand was sought by Baron Felmersham. Despite his advances, he was met with refusal, and so, enraged by the rebuff, Felmersham traversed an underground tunnel which led from Radwell to Odell and sought to capture her. He attacked the castle, and when repulsed he set fire to it and razed it to the ground. This sounds all very fantasy-like, but it might well have happened, you know. In later times, the castle was a secret rendezvous for priests and usurpers fleeing from tyranny and religious suppression. In 1623, Sir William Alston appeared on the scene and built a new house on the site of the castle, utilising the remains of its old keep. That is not this building, though. Again, fire got involved. Alston's house burned down on Tuesday, the 19th of February, 1931. The fire brigades from both Bedford and Rushton in Northamptonshire were deployed to extinguish the blaze. Villagers who readily helped were able to save several antique pieces of furniture and valuables, including a painting called Diana of the Chase by Gainsborough. In 1934, the Odell Castle estate was sold at auction to the first Lord Luke of Pavenham. It was gradually rebuilt, and in 1962, the second Lord Luke was able to move in with his family. The castle was put up for sale again in 1997, along with much of the remaining Odell Castle estate. The current Lord Luke, Ian James St John Lawson Johnston, try saying that 10 times fast, still resides in this house today. He's the great-grandson of George Lawson Johnston, who founded the title in 1929. 61 High Street, adjacent to the castle by the way, is the Odell Estate Office. And of course, in keeping with fortifications such as Odell Castle, it's on a hill. So what we're doing now is making our way downhill into the village. This is going to be a slog to walk back up later, I'm telling you that for free. Big wall around the edge of the castle, you see. It might not be a castle anymore, it might just be a house, but it's still heavily guarded with all sorts of things. So yeah. Right, next to see is a school. Now we're at the school, and thankfully this is a much easier building to understand than the ones we met in Harrold. Education in Odell can be traced back to 1818, when a select committee was established to inquire into the educational provision for the poor. At that time, the only education available was through Sunday schools, which taught about 40 children. Odell had 3 Sunday schools. 2 of them were Church of England, whilst the other, which began later in 1830, was run by independents and maintained by subscription. Now, despite that 1818 date, a state school was not built in the village until 1860. That wasn't this. Instead, it was a small building located near the church, which could hold 88 children. This replaced it from what I understand, although there were no dates available for its construction. Interestingly, the lace industry had an effect on school attendance here. Lace manufacture saw children work at a factory, splitting their time between there and school. Children also worked for local farmers, especially at harvest time. As a result, this school was rarely full. Odell never formed a school board, and thus this school was C of E. It later became a public elementary and then Odell voluntary controlled county primary. That turned into a lower school before finally closing in 1983 due to falling pupil numbers. It's now a private house. Just up the street we have the village hall, and this is the only thing on today's walk I found absolutely nothing about. I did manage to get a date of establishment though, 1999. Looking at its location and layout of the buildings around it, I'd say it's a converted old barn. What do you reckon? Now, to get back to the start, we could just turn around here and go back up the street, but there's another way. Follow me along a footpath that will take us to Odell Play Area, and then up Horsefair Lane to the Bell and the Village Green. Well, I found my way to a community orchard. Check this out, people. There we go. Community orchard. Brilliant. It says here, the fruit in this orchard is free, but please be considerate and only pick fruit that's ripe and leave plenty for others to enjoy. Here's the play area. It's one of those that's definitely hidden away amongst a mass of trees and greenery alongside the River Greatouse. It's modest with a small area of play equipment and a football pitch, but for what it is, it does its job rather nicely. Now we're at the Bell, number 81 High Street. This is the only public house still in operation anywhere in Odell parish. The Bell is an old building dating back to the 17th century, although it has been much extended and modernised since those days. It's built of limestone rubble mainly and has 2 stories, but unusually for a public house, there's no cellar. It cannot be said with any certainty when the Bell was established as an inn. The first records of it only go back to 1736, when it was owned by a baker called John Amos. During World War II, the local ARP wardens used a room at the rear of the Bell as a warden's post. The pub later belonged to the Alston family, as did most of the rest of the village, until they sold it to Bedford brewers Higgins & Sons Limited in 1926. In 1931, they in turn sold it to Wells & Winch. That means this became a Green King tied house in 1961, and so it remains today. This 300-year-old pub retains many traditional features, including its thatched roof and a very attractive facade. The lawned garden is within throwing distance of the River Great Ouse, creating a real draw for walkers. Alright, it's parish notice board time. Let's liberate myself of one of these things. Now then, we're going to put the card in this one. There we go. Bit of creativity goes a long way, doesn't it? Now, Odell is not the sort of parish with which you would instantly associate a market. However, in 1221, a guy called William Fitzwarine paid 100 shillings for the right to hold a market here. Nobody knows where it would have been held, but the chances are it would have been this green. A year later, in 1222, a prohibition was placed on the market's rights whilst it was investigated whether or not it would be too much competition for the market at Olney in Buckinghamshire. It seems a little outlandish to think that. I mean, Olney is far bigger, and this was a tiny village. It was eventually proved that any market in Odell would not have been too much for Olney, and so it continued to be held every Thursday until at least 1236, when the right was confirmed to the Baron and Lord of the Manor of the time, Saher de Wahel. I've no idea when the market ceased though. Lastly, our walk takes us to Odell Mill. Like many of the villages that line the River Great Ouse, the Domesday Book records a mill in Odell which was in operation when Walter was around building his castle on the hill. We've no idea if it was here, but this is where Odell Mill sits today. This mill formed part of the Odell Castle estate, and so it was therefore owned by the Alston family for the 300 years between 1633 and 1934. Very few records exist for it, making any coherent history of the mill impossible. However, I did get a couple of bits. If directory evidence is to be believed, the mill seems to have largely ceased operations between 1903 and 1910. It's listed in Kelly's directory for 1903, but the 1910 edition doesn't list a miller. Despite that, a report from 1919 noted the mill was still in working order. So what did it mill exactly? Well, it started life as a corn mill, but later changed to other uses, primarily becoming a sawmill. It's built of stone and tile and has 3 floors, the area of each measuring 40 feet by 30. There was also a range of ancillary stone and slate buildings too. The mill, like most of the rest of the estate, was purchased at the auction by Lord Luke. It was then drained of most of its water in 1945, and 2 years later planning permission was granted to convert the mill into a private house. So it remains today. Now, one thing I've noticed about these Bedfordshire villages so far is that they tend to have massive village signs, like this one for example. Harrold had one of these as well. I didn't catch it though yesterday. And I drove through a place called Turvey yesterday too, and that also had a big sign akin to this. They're quite fancy, aren't they? Right, from here, it's a case of walking back up the hill to where I began. Wish me luck. Now, before we wrap this one up, we have to chuck in a mention of Santa Pod Raceway, because if I don't, you can guarantee someone will complain. North of the village is the former RAF Poddington, most of which falls within Odell. It's a former World War II airfield, which today is used for racing. The airfield opened in 1942 and closed in 1946. It was built for the Royal Air Force but was handed to the United States Army Air Force and was used by the 92nd, 100th and 301st Bomb Groups. The field included a control tower, hangars, barracks, admin buildings, bomb stores and ammunition dumps. Since 1966, the site has been used for drag racing, the main runway being resurfaced for it in 1972. Despite being known as Santa Pod, none of its site is in Poddington. Many of the buildings are in Sharnbrook and most of the drag strip is in Odell. Santa Pod hosts both the first and last round of the FIA and FIM/UEM European Drag Racing Championships, as well as the British National Drag Racing Championships. It's also been the venue for the annual Bug Jam Weekend since 1987. Santa Pod for many years remained the fastest all-asphalt drag strip in the world, since most North American tracks are partially or entirely concrete in construction. However, during the winter of 2017 and 18, the entire length of the track was lifted and replaced with concrete. The reason for that is because concrete apparently gives more consistent times, as it moves around less, in inverted commas, than asphalt. Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham once drove a dragster at this raceway for a fantasy sequence in a film called The Song Remains the Same. 2 down, 47 to go in Bedford. We've made a rather good start here, I reckon. So let's continue. To get to the next one, it's a case of continuing eastwards. We're off to a village that's almost completely encircled by the River Great-Ouse next. Join me there tomorrow. Welcome back to Bedford again, people, for round number 3. Now, of all the villages I planned on this initial Bedford run, this is the one that I was the most excited about. And the reason for that is very, very simple. It's because this route is going to be easy. It's a nice, beautiful little circle, and it's got everything to talk about. This is Felmersham. Felmersham, Faluma's homestead. Today in Bedford we come to Felmersham, a lovely village surrounded on 3 sides by the windy course of the River Great-Ouse. The parish also includes the hamlet of Radwell, and the two sit within an arc of the river, which accounts for a staggering 70% of the parish boundary. So to get to this one, you have to cross the river, and access to the parish is provided by an early 19th century river bridge to the north and a mid 18th century bridge to the south. The first settlers here were attracted by the river. Evidence of Bronze Age occupation has been found in Radwell, and likewise Iron Age settlement in Felmersham. In 1942, further evidence of those periods were uncovered thanks to extensive gravel extraction on the riverbank, which turned up a series of Iron Age burials and cremations. The medieval parish church of St Mary's is regarded as one of the finest early English Gothic buildings in the region, and was probably built on the site of an Anglo-Saxon church. The only other medieval building to survive is the tithe barn, which was converted into dwellings in the 1980s. There is, somewhat surprisingly, very little evidence of Anglo-Saxon occupation here, but this area has been occupied since at least 100 BC. Between 1801 and the start of World War II, Felmersham's economy was largely dependent upon agriculture and the cottage industry of lace making. Let's have a look at it all. Here we have Felmersham parish as it was in 1900. The name is of Saxon origin, denoting that the place was the riverside dwelling of Feluma and his people. You can clearly see the river here surrounding Felmersham on 3 sides. Nowadays, less than 1% of its residents are employed in agriculture. Both Felmersham and the hamlet of Radwell can be considered commuter dorms. This was encouraged by a series of 1960s and 1970s housing developments in Felmersham and a lot of infilling at Radwell. So, has the shape and layout of the place changed much when compared to the modern? Well, no, not really. It still retains the general look and feel that you see here, although the biggest difference is the number of houses. Here, where you can see gaps, there are now new estates and infills. Marked on this map are various things we'll see as we go around. You can see the bridge over the river in the north. That's still there. So too is the church. Mind you, that's been here since the 13th century and it's going nowhere fast. The school opposite that, though, has moved now further east. You can also see 3 inns on this map. Interestingly, the Six Ringers is the only one that's referred to by name. The one near that is now the only pub left in business in Felmersham. The third pub was close to the church. That too has now closed. So this is the modern village. As you can see, it's pretty much the same as it was 125 years ago, with a smattering of newer buildings and infills complementing the older portions. So let's have a walk around it, and this is going to be our route. We'll start with the playground next to the village hall and the modern school. Heading west, we'll walk to the end of Memorial Lane to check out the manor house before turning southwards. That will take us to the War Memorial at the other end of the Dead Straight Road. From there, we'll loop around the south, taking in the beautiful Sun Inn on Grange Road and the former Six Ringers not too far from it. The road then arcs northwards towards Hunt's Lane, affording us a look at Felmersham Bridge and the River Great Ouse. We'll then hit the high road, passing the old school, the church and the tithe barn, before rounding off the walk at the old plough. To finish the episode, we'll then drive through Radwell, which is away to the east. It's a simple enough route, really. Let's do it. Let's get things started with the playground on something called the Old Road. We'll learn later why this is called the Old Road. It's all to do with a nearby village called Sharnbrook. It's a dead end to the east. This playground is the only recreational facility in Felmersham, and it's next to the village hall. Now, the village hall in this place is within the same building as Pinch Mill School, Felmersham's only educational establishment these days. Pinch Mill School was established here in 1974 to replace an older school that still stands near the church, further up this road into the main village. So what we have here is a joint facility whereby the new school combined with the village hall. You certainly don't see this in every village, do you? Fundraising within the community provided the village share of the building costs for this unique venture. Let's head on up Old Road to the next stop. We've reached the corner of Memorial Lane where we find the manor house. The main building was built in around 1840 as an extension to an original 300-year-old farmhouse. Some buildings belonging to Manor Farm were converted in the early 1970s into a dwelling known as the Old Barn. It's always good when road names give you a clue as to what's coming up next. There's not a lot on this road, to be quite honest, but when you get to the top, you find the War Memorial. Memorial Lane takes its name from the War Memorial at the southern end. It records the deaths of all 19 parishioners who gave their lives in World War I. A further 44 returned home safely. It also commemorates the 3 Wells brothers who were killed in World War II. Arriving at the junction of the High Road and Grange Road, here we have a row of former labourers' cottages. These were built in the late 1840s. On the end of the row is Beaconsfield Cottage, a double-fronted Victorian house once lived in by the village undertaker. His former workshop is at the rear. Number 7 High Road is an interesting building because it was originally, get this, 3 cottages. In the early 1950s, the 3 former properties were converted into a single bungalow by removing the upper stories. For many years, this served as the post office. Right, let's talk about the village local. The Sun Inn has been a pub from at least 1822. Before that, it was 3 cottages. On the corner opposite, which is now the Garden of Gladstones, there were 2 dwellings. They were demolished in the 1960s. This is the only pub that Felmersham has these days, given that the Plough and the Six Ringers are long gone. Being a pub, there's no reason why you can't just call in here for a drink, but there are other reasons to appreciate this fabulous building, with its gorgeous thatched roof. A typical 17th century English building, this is run by a 4-person team by the names of Pete, Connie, Laura and JJ. They took over the inn in 2019 with a vision to provide a welcoming home for their neighbours and locals from further afield by offering quality hospitality and nourishment. Given the pub's historic past, stretching back 300 years, it was starting to look a little tired. So in the summer of 2022, with the help of many local trades, they set about restoring and preparing the pub for the next 300 years. You're looking at the result, a very pleasant Bedfordshire local. And given that Felmersham sits within an arc of the River Great Ouse, the Sun is one of the best places to view that watercourse in the village. The only thing is you have to get married to do that, because the view can only be appreciated fully from the top floor of the bridal suite. Now, as well as the Sun, there used to be another pub here in Felmersham. It was called the Six Ringers, and we're heading towards that right now. Moving on up Grange Road, next on the left is Town Lot Lane, which gets its name from town, the old name for village, and lot meaning allotment. The village allotment was part of the enclosure settlement of 1776, and the allotments at the top of the lane are still in use. On the right next is the former pub known as the Six Ringers. It's of an uncertain age, but it may be over 400 years old. The name is a little weird when you consider that it was likely named after the church bell ringers. Why 6 ringers when up until 1955 the church only had 5 bells? It seems odd, right? Well, a report in 1880 indicated that 2 men were needed to ring the heavy-hung 1-ton tenor, hence the need for 6 bell ringers. In 1955, the bells were rehung and augmented to a ring of 8 bells. 40 years later, this pub closed. I wonder, if it reopened, would it be called the 8 Ringers these days? I've just come past a house there with the name The Old Squash Court. That's interesting, isn't it? A house which has been converted from an old squash court. Brilliant. Now, at this point it's become very leafy and I can hear the sound of water, rushing water to my left hand side. That means we must be near the River Great Ouse once again. Okay, so now we're at the river which forms the parish boundary. Felmersham sits in an arc formed by the course of the river, meaning on three sides you have to cross water to get out. That brings us to Felmersham Bridge. This was built in 1818 before being strengthened and repaired in 1993. There has never been a weight restriction placed upon this bridge, despite its age. I guess though that's a tribute to those early 19th century bridge builders. They made stuff to last in those days, and this has certainly stood the test of time. To build the bridge, money was raised by private subscription. Work began in the May of 1818, and soon a bridge of 4 arches was declared passable for pedestrians and horsemen. It opened on the 31st of August. Later came the addition of an extra arch, and the bridge was finally fully finished in December. Now, on the other side of the bridge is some land that's not within Felmersham Parish, but it is worth mentioning. As we learned yesterday, gravel and sand were extracted from the area around these Bedford villages in quite large amounts. Felmersham was no different. Over the river are the Felmersham pits, where gravel was quarried. Most gravel quarries existed to provide materials for road building. Here, though, things were a little different. During World War II, gravel quarried here was to be used in the construction of wartime airfields and other military needs. In January 1942, a bronze bowl, a fish head spout and other bronze fragments were found during gravel extractions at these pits. They are thought to be part of the contents of a burial vault dating from the late Iron Age. The items can now be found in Bedford Museum. Over the decades, the disused and flooded gravel pits have been managed as a nature reserve, and they provide a protected area for many varieties of flora and fauna today. It's also important as a bird sanctuary, both as a breeding habitat and for birds on migration. So if you come over the Ouse using the causeway, the first thing you see when you enter Felmersham is the church. The big, tall, massive, impressive building which you can kind of see in shot here. You'll see it better in a second. There it is. Let's talk about this next. Before Pinch Mill School was ever a thing in Felmersham, there was this place. This is the old schoolhouse. It was built in 1846 and it was used as the village school until its replacement was built in 1974. In the mid-19th century, Felmersham's only other educational options were Sunday schools. In 1833 there were 2 Sunday schools. One was supported by the vicar, where 50 children were taught. In the other, 48 children were supported by a Methodist congregation. Children from Radwell also attended those schools. Radwell, of course, being a small village also within Felmersham Parish, which we'll see later. This school became a public elementary in 1903, a county primary in 1946, and then it was known as Pinch Mill County Primary in the 1960s and Pinch Mill Lower School in the 1970s. Of course, in 1974, it moved to its current location a ways away from the village centre. The school logbook shows that it wasn't just local children who were educated in this place. During World War II, several children were evacuated from Eastbourne in Sussex to Felmersham, and so they were taught here. As you can imagine, the number of children attending the school rose dramatically. The entry for September the 11th, 1939 says there were 41 on roll. 24 belonged to Felmersham and Radwell, 6 were government evacuees, and the other 11 were staying in the village as their homes were in vulnerable areas. All 41 children brought gas masks to school. How different wartime was. Next door to the old school is St Mary's Church. It was built between 1220 and 1240 by the monks of Lenton Priory in Nottinghamshire. Why they chose to build this here is not known, but a likely explanation is that they were going to build a satellite monastery in the village and ran out of resources. Whatever the explanation, they built what is regarded today as one of the finest early English Gothic buildings in the region. The most important external feature of this one is the west front. It's considered to be one of the best examples of early English architecture anywhere in Bedfordshire. Let's not take anything away from the rest of this church. The nave is lined with alternate round and octagonal pillars, and the central tower is supported on 4 finely moulded columns. Both of these features are early English Gothic architecture. A medieval oak screen divides the chancel from the choir. There are traces of paint on the southeast nave pillar, indicating that in earlier times all of the columns were painted. There are also the remains of wall paintings in the ringing chamber, which in former times would have formed part of a chancel arch painting. The chancel was restored in 1853 when large Gothic windows were replaced by the present lancet windows. Also in the chancel is a double piscina and an aumbrey. Reglazed in 1951, the east window records the deaths of those 3 brothers in World War II, which we mentioned earlier. The oak screen can be dated to the early 15th century. Other points of interest here are the pulpit, dated 1895, a funeral bier from 1893, and the wooden-framed, flail-locking turret clock, which is possibly mid-17th century. There's also a millennium window installed in 2001 by public subscription. Perhaps the best-known feature of St Mary's is the large handle on its south door. That's known as a sanctuary ring. Here's how it worked. If fugitives held onto it, they could claim sanctuary, i.e. the protection of the church. A word for the lick gate, by the way. Notice how similar this is to the bus shelter on the end of Church End. I reckon the bus shelter was designed to reflect the style of the lick gate to make it look like they were twins. The shelter was built in 1936, whilst the lick gate was constructed earlier in 1917. And there's a plaque to read in this bus shelter as well. It's in loving memory of Christopher James Maltby and Jessie Maltby, both of this parish, and they both died in 1937, according to this. Right, we have just a handful of things left to see. So if we come out of the bus shelter and head this way, this big building on the corner is next. We're going to go past that and head towards the old plough, and at that point we're almost done. Opposite the church is the tithe barn, built in 1428. Now it's a row of private houses after it was sympathetically converted into 4 dwellings in the early 1980s. Prior to this, it had stood empty for many years and was slated for demolition. The conversion saved it from such a fate. Walking west along Church End, you're then following what used to be the old road to Sharnbrook, the original cobbled pathway of which is still visible near the churchyard wall. On your left is a new development called St Mary's Close, which is built on land formerly belonging to the old plough. Last but not least on this walk, we have another former pub to discuss. The old plough was built in 1938 and it's now a private dwelling. But hold on, 1938? There was an inn marked here on the old map, wasn't there? Yes, there was. The present building replaced an earlier pub. Take note of the houses next door here. They are 2 mansard-roofed semi-detached cottages built in around 1994. Even though they haven't been here all that long, they already blend in nicely with the other older stone properties. See, that's how you do architectural innkeeping properly. Okay, we are literally just a few paces away from where we began at the school. Now, to finish this episode off, we need to have a drive through the little hamlet of Radwell, which is also within Felmersham's boundary. It's about 3/4 of a mile away from where we are right now. So let's hop in the car and do that to finish it off. To finish with, let's have a drive through Radwell. This is a small secondary village, or if you like, a hamlet, that also falls within the boundaries of Felmersham. This used to have a pub called the Swan Inn, but that's closed now. Look to your left as we enter and you'll see the building. The main road through Radwell is entirely residential. It's called Moor End Road because the very top of the village is known as Moor End. It's a mixture of modern dwellings and more traditional houses and cottages. It's only about 1/4 of a mile from end to end. At the top end of Moor End Road you can walk on further because it turns into an unmade lane. After approximately 50 yards you can then cross over a private road and continue up the lane until it ends at a gate. You can use that to form a circular walk back to the Swan. With another Bedford parish completed, we're off to find another. Now, tomorrow's episode will see us take on a village we've already mentioned a few times before, most notably yesterday in Odell. Join me there to learn a bit more about the Bovril Baron. Now, who might he have been? Hello folks, welcome back to Bedford again for episode number 4. Now, this one's going to be quite the fun walk when we eventually get to the walk, because I've got to go up and down hill and do all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. There's even a point where I'm going to be right on the banks of the River Great Ouse, hoping not to fall in. If I do, I'll make sure I get it on camera so you can all have a good laugh. Anyway, we've got to get there first. We're beginning here at the playing field and the village hall, which is a long way out of civilization in this one. Welcome to Pavenham. Pavenham, Papa's homestead. Today on TVI we hit the lovely village of Pavenham, yet another one that sits on the River Great Ouse in the borough of Bedford. This is an attractive village with many stone buildings, delightful riverside walks and lots of osier beds. It's the latter that puts this village on the map. Pavenham was well known for its rush work, which involved cutting and using the reeds and rushes in the ooze and turning them into things like baskets, table mats and even hats. The osier beds on the ooze these days are still grown and cut regularly, keeping the tradition going. The north of the village is a rather interesting area. You'll find some superb Jacobean carvings at the Church of St Peter, which also has an impressive tower and 5 bells. Pavenham Golf Course has a challenging 18 holes set in an idyllic parkland with many water features. That parkland once belonged to a massive house which had to be demolished after a fire. It was associated with the Alston family and later a man called Sir George Lawson Johnson, better known as Lord Luke. In some circles, he was also known as Baron Bovril. Yes, indeed, I am talking about the beefy drink you might have when it's cold outside. We'll discover Pavenham's links to Bovril in this video, as well as taking in the rest of this awesome little place in the process. There's loads to cover in this one, so sit back and enjoy this tour of Papa's homestead. Here's how Pavenham Parish appeared on the 1900 map. Again, we're in a village that's almost completely encircled by the River Great-Ouse, only this time there are no gravel quarries. Here, the riverbank was utilised for its rushes and osiers. Farming was, of course, also a prevalent industry. All around the village there were several fields, and that's not really changed. This is still a village with a very agricultural feel to it. There are no outlying hamlets in this one, so let's concentrate on the main village a little more. Zoomed in now, let's go through some of the landmarks that were here a century and a quarter ago. Straight away, your eyes are drawn to the huge parkland in the east. It's fair to say that looks a little different now. At the edge of the parkland here, you can see the words Pavenham Bury. That's referring to a massive house just to the south of the church. It no longer stands because it was demolished in 1961. The church is still there though. Looking to the southernmost areas, you can see a chapel is marked. That's now gone, but there is another chapel that's not marked here. By way of a simple PH for public house, the Cock Inn is marked here, but the one that's shown on this map is not the same building that's here today. Not marked is the school, but you can tell which building it is. It's here, and that's still very much standing. So how does all that translate to the modern village? Well, here's how. Essentially, the main village is still the same insofar as the main road goes. We're still dealing with a linear village, but now the eastern portion of it looks a bit different. That parkland has gone, replaced with a golf course. Here's how we're going to explore this village. To begin with, we'll start at the village hall and the playing fields, which are separated from the rest of Pavenham to the east. We'll then drive into the village and start our walk here on Mill Lane. That's so we can check out the osier beds near the Great-Ouse. After doing that, we'll head up to the main street, passing the two chapels before heading north over some fields to the church. That'll be an uphill slog, so be prepared for that bit. On reaching the church, we'll spend a bit of time there before then exploring this new housing estate to the south of it. In doing so, we'll learn about the village's connection to some notable people, as well as explaining what happened to Pavenham Bury. Church Lane then takes us to the War Memorial before we cut back towards Mill Lane using the rest of the main street, passing the current Cock Inn on the way. So, with lots of footpaths to use here, this one promised to be quite the adventure. Let's see how I got on. To start proceedings in Pavenham then, we're at the village hall located a long way out of the main village to the east. Mind you, it's worth the effort to come and see this one. This isn't just the village hall, it's also the playing field, all rolled into one. The village hall has several uses. One of them is as the base of the Pavenham Women's Institute. That was one of the first to be started in Bedfordshire. It was inaugurated in 1910 and it's been thriving ever since, providing the ladies of the village with an interesting monthly meeting. The history of the village hall is sketchy at best. The current building has been in use since 1980. It replaced a previous hall which had been modernised back in 1959. This shouldn't be confused with the Sports Pavilion. That's a separate building. Speaking of sports, several are played in this area. The story of the cricket club is linked to Felmersham, the village we were in yesterday. In the early 1900s, Felmersham Cricket Club, which was also known as the Toff team, played on the meadow on the Sharnbrook side of the River Great-Ouse. On occasion, they were umpired by Squire Green, who lived at the Grange, hence the name Toff. Now, you'll recall yesterday that we never mentioned the cricket club in that video, and that's because they don't play on that same field anymore. In fact, they don't even play in Felmersham. In 2006, Felmersham joined forces with Pavenham to form the club that use this ground today. This is because Felmersham could no longer field a full side. So what we have today is a merger, Pavenham and Felmersham cricket club. As an ECB-affiliated community club, they are open to all. They have 2 adult teams playing in the Bedfordshire Invitation Saturday League. They also have teams at under 10, under 12 and under 14 in the Bedford Youth League. Football-wise, Pavenham FC play in the Bedfordshire County Leagues, and the playing field also has a tennis club over on the far side. Beyond the trees, there's also a golf club. See, I told you this is a very sporty area, now didn't I? There is a path across the course, but it's easier to show you it in pictures. Pavenham Park Golf Club opened in 1994 and has since established itself as the premier golfing location in Bedfordshire. The course and clubhouse were officially opened by Ian Poulter and Justin Rose, and they followed that up by playing an exhibition match. The course has everything you would expect from an undulating parkland layout. It offers a well-crafted golf experience in a naturally secluded environment. Impeccably conditioned, it continues to evolve to meet golfers' needs, whilst also offering new challenges at the same time. With 5 par 5s and 5 par 3s, the course offers an abundance of birdies coupled with some of the toughest short holes in the region. The final challenge is to master and understand the unique USPGA style greens, which have often been compared to the banks and slopes at Augusta. In short, this isn't an easy course to play on. As such, there's a saying that goes with Pavenham Park, which you should take into account before you start wielding your clubs. It simply goes, if you can putt at Pavenham Park, you can putt anywhere. Good luck, golfers. Let's drive into Pavenham now. It's not a lengthy trip, but I still felt it was easier than walking, especially given that between the playing fields and the War Memorial, there isn't much to film on foot. A lot of it is just trees. Pavenham is a very leafy village. My first task was to head down Mill Lane towards the River Great Ouse. Now, as far as a watermill goes in this village, my efforts to pin down anything about one fell woefully short. To be honest though, the mill is kind of not the reason I wanted to come down here. You see, for a long time, Pavenham has been associated with osier beds. It's been a while since we talked about them, so here's a recap. An osier bed, or alternatively an osiery, is where historically willows were planted and coppiced to produce withies, which were then used for several purposes. Commonly, withies were used to make baskets or fish traps. Osier beds worked well anywhere where the ground was reedy or marshy, so the fringes of rivers, especially those which often flood or those with small islands, were common locations. Here in Pavenham, both things are true. The Pavenham osier beds cover 1.3 hectares of wet, marshy meadowland. It's a designated nature reserve on the banks of the River Great Ouse, managed by the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. Although commercial basket weaving disappeared in the 20th century, here in Pavenham the osier beds are still planted and cut, and they're supplying material for basket weavers. That's thanks to the work of the Trust, who continue this tradition by planting more osiers every year. The best time to see the osier beds is in the summer, when this attractive riverside setting draws visitors from the public footpath at the end of Mill Lane. Visitors to the site can see the rare meadow rue in full bloom. It's an uncommon flower which likes wet meadows like these. Pavenham historically was associated with the craft of rushwork, which has been practised here since the mid-17th century. Several shops in the village produced large rolls of matting for covering floors of large buildings, including cathedrals and even the Houses of Parliament. common bulrush has been harvested in Pavenham for at least 200 years. Rush cutters waded, often chest deep, into the River Great Ouse and cut the rushes using a rush hook. These were then bundled into bolts and stacked together to form rafts or rooks, which could be punted along. So as it turned out, I didn't have to get all the way up to the bank of the Ouse. I thought I was going to have to be like literally treading water to do that, but apparently not. The osier beds come quite a way away from the bank. So I'm not getting wet today. Go me. Right, okay, let's make our way back to Mill Lane, and we'll head up Mill Lane towards the site of a chapel, and we'll see what else Pavenham has got to its name. Now, next to cover, we have the first of the two chapels that used to serve this village. Near the end of Orchard Close is the site of a former Wesleyan chapel, and site is the right word because the chapel is no longer standing. In its place is this house with the name Chapel Site. I mean, it's not wrong. The chapel was built in 1857 and was demolished in 1963. Very little is known about it, and the same can be said for the Wesleyans in general in this village. There was a primitive Methodist presence in this village too, though. Their old place of worship is still standing. Follow me. In 1842, Pavenham was noted as a primitive Methodist preaching place. 10 years later, John Simons Gosling, an upholsterer from Bedford, registered a building for worship here on the 8th of October. A second registration was made in 1859 by Joseph Houlat, a baker from Pavenham. The resulting chapel was this, which still stands tall on the high street next to The Retreat, which is a holistic therapy centre. Just looking at this building, one would assume the primitive presence in Pavenham was a strong one. It's not exactly a small chapel, this, is it? However, looks can be deceiving. The primitive cause in this village never really prospered, and by 1884 the chapel was already being put up for sale. It did sell after a short time, eventually becoming the garage of The Retreat. Now, though, it's been converted into a private house. Okay, everything since Mill Lane has been slightly uphill. It makes a bit of sense when you think about it because we're in a river valley here, so there are going to be some hills involved. It does mean there's going to be a downhill section later, but of course getting to the top of the hill is going to prove quite difficult. That's what I'm about to do now. I'm following a footpath now which will take us to the church. This goes cross country, so for a while there will be no civilization. Now then, people, how many times have I crossed a field on a footpath and said, oh, it's great that the farmer has managed to keep the path, you know, visible and open. Well, here that is not the case. This farmer wants a bullet as far as I'm concerned, because you tell me where the footpath is. Yep, that's right, you can't see it. It's been ploughed away, which is very, very poor if you ask me, but there you go. That's exactly how some farmers are. Now then, we are almost off the path anyway. I've managed to follow it thanks to Strava, and the next job is to see the church. Now we're at the church, situated on a site where people have been worshipping God for centuries. This church is dedicated to St. Peter, and it's been here since the 13th century. There was almost certainly a church on this site in Saxon times though, although no documents exist to prove that. The first documentary evidence for a church here comes in the form of a papal letter of 1205. That established that Pavenham's church was not independent, but was instead a parochial chapel attached to Felmersham, and so its clergy were appointed by Lenton Priory in Nottinghamshire. Lenton Priory relinquished Felmersham in 1283 and control later passed to King's Hall, Cambridge, which, as a result of university reorganisation, eventually became Trinity College in 1543. They were then associated with Pavenham until 1859, when it became an independent parish. Why is all of that important then? Well, the link between the church and Trinity College is still remembered in a ceremony that dates back to the time when the college permitted the parish clerk to gather as much grass as he could between sunrise and sunset from one of 3 open fields. In July, 11 days after the Feast of St. Peter, the aisles of the church are strewn with newly mown hay as a token of thanks for the gathering of the first hay harvest. The 11-day delay was a direct result of the adoption of the Gregorian calendar in 1752, when 11 calendar days were lost. So to the church building itself then. This was built by the Pavenham family, who were granted one of the 3 manors that existed in Pavenham after the Norman conquest. That manor eventually became known as the Bury. Keep that name in mind for a few moments' time. The building stone is an oolitic limestone which outcrops locally. It may well have been extracted from the quarry that was situated beside the footpath which leads from the top of the village playing field and then around Pavenham Park golf course. Initially, the church was a relatively simple building consisting of a nave and a chancel. The only part of this building which can still be positively identified is the remnant of a more rounded and massive arch which can be seen in the wall of the south porch to the left of the entrance to the church. The de Pavenham family were benefactors of St. Peter's and were probably responsible for building the north chapel and the south transept. The transept may have originally been a side chapel commissioned by Joan de Pavenham to commemorate her husband Lawrence, the last of his line. St. Peter's Church exhibits 3 phases of medieval Gothic architecture: Early English, Decorated and Perpendicular. All 3 phases are characterised by pointed arches in contrast to the rounded arches of the earlier Romanesque period. On exiting the church, we then find ourselves in a housing estate. Now, this might look like your typical average 20th century development, but this area has a history that simply cannot be ignored. If you're local and over the age of 70, the chances are you will remember what was here. This was the site of the Bury, a massive house which was pulled down in 1961 after standing in a derelict state for a few years prior. It was already semi-derelict in the mid-1950s, but fell into complete ruin before it was eventually demolished. Its garden was overgrown with brambles at the end. It used to be a great area for children. Even though they weren't supposed to, they would explore the ruins. One account I found about the place was written by a man who, as a young boy, discovered a huge steam engine that would have provided power for the Bury's water supply. This new estate now covers the site of the house and its grounds. The whole site used to be covered in huge estate-type trees like elms, limes, oak, and of course the back drive to the Bury itself. It's certainly changed a bit now, but at least the modern street still retains the name. So why did the Bury end up in a derelict state? It's a common tale as far as England's lost country houses go. The house was formerly known as Burystead Manor House, and the alternative form of Pavenham Bury was adopted after the house was extensively remodelled in 1842. That turned it into the square neo-Jacobean 3x3 bay house which you older folk may remember. It was extended by the addition of an extra bay with a matching bay window, which it gained in the early 20th century. However, there was an earlier house at the core. As such, it retained an 18th century staircase, perhaps dating from a short period of ownership by John Franklin. It was left abandoned after being badly damaged by a fire. Some of its fixtures and fittings were reused to fit out the former stables and coach house, which is now known as Pavenham Court. Several people who we have already mentioned this week lived at the Bury. These included several members of the Alston family who were here between 1647 and 1745. Sir George Lawson Johnston, the first Baron Luke, lived at the Bury too, as did his son, the second Baron Luke. Okay, having made it through the Bury, we are now on the road back down towards the main street. And it's downhill. The hills have kind of disappeared now. It should be flat to the end. So that's good for my legs and my feet, quite frankly. So next to see is the War Memorial, which is on the corner of the road I'm currently walking on. After making our way through the Bury estate, we've marched our way down Church Lane to its junction with Oakley Road. At this intersection we have the War Memorial. It takes the form of a stone cross mounted on a stone plinth. In turn, that stands on 2 concrete plinths. There are 11 names on this one for those who were lost in World War I, and the other 7 are the World War II casualties. The memorial was built by Messrs S.W. Jarvis & Son, and the architect was George P. Allen. As for the site of this, that was donated by Sir George Lawson Johnston, the first Baron Luke. Next we have Pavenham National School, which used to be run by the Church of England. Of all the schools we've seen this week, I think this one is easily the prettiest. What do you reckon? This was built in 1853 by the Reverend Joseph Tucker, another former resident of the Bury. It has an unusual gable with a bell turret and a clock, and the latter of those remembers the school's founder. The plaque on it reads, "This clock was placed here in affectionate remembrance of Joseph Tucker, AD 1877. The school closed in 1983, and now Pavenham's children have to go elsewhere. Right, opposite the school we have a parish notice board, and you know what that means by now. So let's put a card in. Oh, it's open. I wasn't expecting that. Oh, it's a magnet board as well. I love these magnet boards. There you go. Brilliant. Pavenham in the books. Oh, it's not going to close now for some reason. There we go. They can be awkward at times. Now our next job is to go down the side of the school, down a footpath you can see there. Now that footpath runs between the school and these houses on the left hand side. That one's Wayside Cottage. That one is the old post office. It's still got a post box on the outside. So down the footpath we go, but we're coming back to this street in a moment. Now we've joined a footpath which runs kind of parallel to the main street. You'd have thought there'd be nothing greatly special about this, but I'd spotted something on the map and I was intrigued. Having found nothing about it, I opted to go and see what it was for myself. Well, what I'd spotted was something called the Adam's Apple. It looked like a community garden of some description, I'm not sure what. But I couldn't see any community garden once I got down here. The only garden I can see is this garden, which is definitely not it, because that belongs to the pub which we're about to go to. So quite what the map was driving at there, I have absolutely no idea. Never mind. Let's have a look at the pub next. Here we have Pavenham's only pub, which is called the Cock. There are many pubs across England with cock in their name, and their origin stories are pretty diverse. Many pubs adopted the name in reference to the heraldic charge that's featured on coats of arms since medieval times. In some instances, pubs took their name from cock ale, a kind of beer popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. That was brewed using a boiled rooster and was thought to have aphrodisiacal properties. Others derived their name from the sport of cockfighting, legal in Britain until the 19th century. Nobody knows which of these led to the name of this particular pub, but whatever the provenance, the Cock at Pavenham was a coaching inn for several hundred years before it was destroyed in a fire and rebuilt in 1937. That rebuilt pub is what you see before you right here. Step inside this one and you'll see a series of black and white photographs on the walls of people from Pavenham. There's a story behind those. They're known as pub traits and they were taken by Pete Ford. The idea was for the black and white images to look like they were taken 100 years ago. In total, 34 images of people were taken, and there's even a couple of dogs in there as well. The aim of the Pub Traits project is kind of like what I'm doing, creating a snapshot in time, but it also shows how pubs and the local community are tied together. As far as the village goes, that's it, but we have a couple of former residents to discuss. The first one is Sir George Lawson Johnston, KBE. Once the occupier of the Bury, he was the first Baron Luke, the great-great-grandfather of the man who currently lives in Odell Castle, which we saw on Tuesday. Lord Luke was a British businessman and peer who played a significant role in the development of Bovril, the popular beef extract that so many of us know and love. Now, I don't like it, but on a cold autumn or winter's evening, it's the favoured hot drink of many a Brit. Bovril is a thick, salty meat extract paste, similar to a yeast extract. It's sold in a distinctive bulbous jar and as cubes and granules. These days, Bovril is owned and distributed by Unilever UK and produced in Burton-on-Trent in Staffordshire. When it's made into a drink, Bovril is sometimes referred to in the UK as beef tea. You dilute it with hot water, or less commonly, milk. It can also be used as a flavouring for soups, broth, stews and porridge, or as a spread, especially on toast, in a similar fashion to Marmite and Vegemite. Born in 1873, Sir George was the son of John Lawson Johnston, the founder of Bovril. He worked in Canada, Australia, Africa and Argentina, where he developed expertise in trade and raw materials. In 1896, he returned to England and joined the board of Bovril Limited, becoming vice chairman in 1900. In Argentina, he oversaw the construction of a new Bovril factory in Santa Elena, and it was there he developed his expertise, gaining a first-hand understanding of beef production and processing. The Santa Elena factory was a major success, helping to make Bovril a global brand. The Santa Elena factory was the first Bovril factory to be built outside the United Kingdom, and the factory's construction led to the influx of British workers into Argentina. A small British community soon developed in the town, largely made up of factory workers, engineers, and managers. As in other places, the British community in Santa Elena declined in the 20th century as the factory closed and Argentina's British population dwindled. The Bovril factory ceased to operate in Santa Elena in June 1973. Nevertheless, the factory continued as a meat packing company. There is no doubt that Lord Luke of Pavenham played an important role in the development of Bovril, and the link between Santa Elena and this village, thanks to him, is a fascinating one. It's a story of economic development, cultural exchange and immigration, and of course, the importance of food. Now, before we end this one, here's a final piece on Salim Charles Wilson. To tell his story, we have to go back to 1880, when 3 envoys from the ruler of Buganda in Africa travelled to England with the missionary Charles Wilson to meet Queen Victoria. They were housed for some time in Pavenham, where Charles's father was vicar. After 6 weeks, they began their long return home. However, a young African dinka who had travelled with them, named Hattershil Mashaka Thish, or Salim for short, remained living with the family in the vicarage. Selim's father had been a chief of a Gok Dinka tribe, but in a raid, Selim had been captured and sold into slavery. He had been later released during Romulo Gessi's war against Suleiman Zabaya in 1879 and joined Charles Wilson at Dem Suleiman. Selim therefore attended Pavenham School so that he could learn to read and write. After the death of Charles Wilson in 1881, Selim accompanied his wife in moving to Nottingham, and there he attended Hume-Cliff College. Yes, long-time viewers, that name's familiar, isn't it? Hume-Cliff College was the missionary training institute that was the precursor to Cliff College, which you can find today in the Derbyshire Dales village of Kerbar. Selim continued to live in England and went on to be much in demand as a preacher and a speaker. He authored 2 books, one of which was an autobiography simply titled I Was a Slave. He was baptised in August 1882 and officially given the name Selim Charles Wilson. He later married, and in his final years he owned a general store in Scunthorpe. Put Pavenham in the books, everybody. We have completed number 4, and that means we have one left to visit this week. Come back tomorrow when we'll be exploring not just 1 but 2 villages which used to be separated. These days, though, they're more like conjoined twins. See you soon. Hello folks, welcome back to Bedford for the last episode this week. Now this one's a tale of 2 villages which have combined together to form one parish, and they both have churches. Right behind me there you can see the magnificent church belonging, or once belonging, to the village of Chellington. Now Chellington is just half of this episode. The other bit is Carlton. Welcome to Carlton and Chellington. Carlton and Chellington, Free Peasants Farm and Chelwyn's Farm. To end this initial run in Bedford, we come to Carlton and Chellington. Now this used to be 2 separate parishes which have merged together, and it's not just the boundaries which have become obsolete these days. There is almost no way now to tell which village is which. That's because modern 20th century infilling has glued them together, so much so that now they are one and the same community. Historically, they both had their own main streets, Bridgend in Chellington and the High Street in Carlton. They remain the 2 oldest sections. Joining them you have the Moor and the Causeway, 2 further roads that form a rectangular shape around the entire place. Most of the rectangle sports the main features of the parish, including a post office and a general store, and 2 pubs called the Royal Oak and the Fox. Both villages had their own churches. Chellington's, though, is now not used for religious purposes, but it still has a use. Carlton's is still going. Both churches are located a ways away from the central rectangle, but there are reasons for that, as we will discover. Carlton and Chellington parish also features another community, one that has its own story to tell. South of Carlton's church is the OMNIBUS community, designed for people who have experienced or are at risk of homelessness. It has ties to Nottingham Forest legend Brian Clough. Let's see how. Here's how Carlton and Chellington appeared on the map in 1900, and as you can see, they were separate parishes. The boundary ran down Bridgend in Chellington. That means most of what we'll see in this episode is actually in Carlton, but Chellington has its own story. These two villages were agricultural communities reliant on the huge swathes of land around them. Some of that land was once occupied by medieval villages, most notably the now lost village of Chellington, which was to the east of the modern version. Only the church remains now. The villages have always been linked, and here you can see how. You can see the rectangular shape formed by the four roads that line the boundary of the place: the moor, Bridgend, the causeway, and the high street. Chellington was the bigger settlement back then. Marked here you can see both a public house and a post office. Now, the pub that's on this map is no longer there, but there is another one that replaced it, so in effect the map is still right. It just doesn't tell you the whole story. The post office is a different ballgame. Again, Chellington still has one, but it's not where this says it is. That'll become clearer in a few minutes. Note the school here too. That was actually in Carlton because the boundary ran down Bridgend. Carlton looked a little more sporadic, didn't it? Well, now the place is far bigger because all the fields between it and Chellington have been built on. Part of the new development saw the demolition of this rectory. South of that you can see another inn marked. There were actually two of them here, the other one is not shown for some reason. Ironically, the one that's not marked is the only one that remains in business today. The Baptist chapel is still here too, but it's long since been closed. You can still access the churchyard though. There are many houses shown here which we'll see on our walk, including one where the causeway meets Bridgend. That one's got a horsey theme to it, as we'll discover. The modern village looks like this. The gap between Carlton and Chellington has now disappeared, replaced with 20th century housing estates. In effect, what we have now is a brand new village that's all one, as opposed to two, which were historically separate. So that means we can walk around them in one go. Here's our route. We'll start by covering the church at Chellington separately before beginning our walk at the junction between the causeway and Bridgend. Bridgend will be our first street. We'll then go onto the moor, but in doing so we'll cut through these allotments on a footpath. That'll keep the fans happy. Turning back on ourselves, we'll then go for the school and the village hall before working our way briefly to the causeway. That's so we can then cut across the playing field in order to see some of the newer housing that exists these days. The high street in Carlton will follow as we pass the two pubs, and then it's a simple case of following the causeway back to the start. After the walk, we'll then head to the south to find Carlton's church, the site of Carlton Hall, and the OMNIBUS community on a road called School Lane. In all, this isn't a complicated route, and it should be really easy. It's full of tales and stories, this one. Let's go take a look. Coming from Pavenham to the east, one of the first things that catches your attention on the horizon is the tall spire of St Nicholas's Church. This was Chellington's church, and although it still stands, it's not used for religious services anymore. It does, though, still have a purpose. Pleasantly situated on the summit of a hill, it's a building of stone in the early English and decorated styles, consisting of a chancel, a clerestoried nave, aisles, a south porch, and a decorated western tower with a tall brooch spire containing 4 bells. The earliest parts of the church date from the 13th century. The chancel and the aisles are in the early English style. The nave was rebuilt in the 14th century. The north arcade is slightly earlier than its southern counterpart and dates from the years just after 1300. It's not just the church that's of note on this hill, because the churchyard is just as fascinating. It contains an elaborate tomb to Sir Robert Darling, who, as a boy, used to keep cows on Chellington Hill. In 1767, Darling was Sheriff of London and Middlesex, and in 1768 he was MP for Wendover. So why isn't this in use as a church anymore? Well, the declining population of Chellington led eventually to its closure. It was declared redundant in 1972. As a consequence of that, its side altar's wooden screen found a new home at St Andrew's Church in Ampthill, where it can still be seen today. Happily, the church still stands, having been repaired, refurbished, extended, modernised and brought into the 21st century thanks to a transformation into something called the Chellington Centre. It's a retreat for youth groups and community activities. It's been used as a youth centre since 1978 because initially the Diocese of St Albans used it as such until 1991. By the middle of the 1990s, much work was needed to be done to repair it. In 2004, that work commenced, and a year later, at a cost of £1.2 million, the Chellington Centre was formed. You'll note that the church seemingly sits all on its own on this hill. That wasn't always the case. There used to be a village here surrounding it, but it was abandoned in the 15th century. Why? Well, we don't know that for sure, but it seems to be to do with the Great Plague. There is some evidence to suggest that during the Great Plague years, the villagers burnt down their homes to prevent infection spreading and lived in the church instead. After the plague finished, they then rebuilt their village elsewhere. The rebuilt village is likely to be modern Chellington. If you look closely at the remains of the old village, you may see a medieval track which used to connect Harrold Bridge to Pavenham. Vestiges of this ancient route can still be seen as a holloway. The route roughly follows the hedgerows leading from the bridge up to Chellington Church. It then passes through the deserted medieval village, disappearing beneath Hill Farm before re-emerging just before Frears Wood, continuing on past the site of an old pub called the Chellington Fox Inn. The route passes almost exactly through the highest point of Carlton and Chellington parish. If you bring yourself to this church, you realise just how much of a hilly county Bedfordshire really is. I mean, we saw it yesterday in Pavenham with all those hills up and down all over the place. But if you stand here, you can certainly tell, can't you? You know, you can see for miles up here, and in the distance I can see Harrold's Church, the spire of Harrold's Church, but sort of beyond that, there's all these rolling hills, rolling countryside. Bedfordshire is not as flat as people make out it is. It's got some beautiful countryside, it really has. Okay, so let's get started at the junction of Bridge End and the Causeway, which will also be our end point. Bridge End gets its name thanks to being the road that literally runs to Harrold Bridge, allowing Chellington access to the other side of the River Great Ouse, and to Harrold, of course. The first thing to talk about is the old school. That's this house here. This was never Chellington's school because the parish boundary ran down Bridge End. As a result, with this setback from the road, it was technically in Carlton, and so it was called Carlton School. This school was established in the 1850s, and numbers on its roll ranged wildly depending on the year. Carlton School occupied this building for well over a century, until a new school come Village Hall was opened on the moor in the 1970s, which we'll come to in a few moments. This has since become a private residence. Around the back of this building today is Carrier's Way. That's a new build street which stands on the site of the old playing field, which hosted its last sports day in 1977. The modern school still has a playing field though, so they still continue. Carlton and Chellington didn't receive an official postal service until 1847. Letters came through Harrold, and the receiver in Carlton was John Whitworth, a farmer of Chellington. In 1859, a sub-post office was authorised at Carlton, and the first sub-postmaster was James Keach, a baker. He would combine the post office with a bakery at Bridge End. This building is not the old bakery though. Old OS maps tell us the post office was inside number 3 Bridge End, known as the Den to many these days. That's at the other end of this road. It would later move to number 10. At that point it was run by Christopher Crouch, a jobbing gardener. He died in 1942. 3 years prior it had moved again to number 31, which was a shop known as Crossways. Later, Bertram Wooding, who lived at number 12, bought Crossways and then sold it as a private dwelling. Number 12 would then become the post office and village stores in 1964, and it remains so today. This is actually two old houses which have amalgamated into a single unit as a house and a shop. The older of the two has a date stone of 1624, so you can tell how old this building is. Chellington may no longer have the Fox Inn, but it does have the Royal Oak. This is the only pub in Chellington now, because the others we'll encounter later on this walk are in Carlton. The Royal Oak first enters recorded history with the will of a yeoman called Richard Hood. That was made in 1695. It mentions a cottage in which he lived with his wife Edith. The cottage was not yet a pub or a beer house, but it did have an orchard adjoining it and a rood of land in Churchfield. By 1763 the cottage had become a pub, but it was called the Blue Bell at that time and not the Royal Oak. You would expect, given we're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries here, that the Royal Oak would be a very old building. Instead, as you can see, it's of a 20th century red brick and slate construction. The reason for this is that the old Royal Oak burned down in 1902 and was later rebuilt. The Royal Oak was put up for sale by auction in 1913 along with 6 adjoining cottages and 10 acres of adjoining land. It was leased to Bedford brewer Jarvis & Company, who didn't stay here long. It was taken over by a rival Bedford brewer, Charles Wells, in 1917. Okay, parish notice board time on the side of the pub. Let's sort this out. Job done. Now we're at the top of Bridgend, and this is the Grade 2 listed Chellington House, believed to date from 1670. It stands at the junction of Bridgend and the Moor. In archive documents, its address was number 1 Bridgend, but since 1991, that address has been taken by a new dwelling. Its former name was the Yews, and the earliest record with this name can be found in the census of 1881, which showed a farmer called John Ferry as the owner, living here with his wife, child and 1 servant. By 1890, an Albert Horton was in occupation, and by 1894, the Hiltons were living here. Susanna and Harriet Hilton were described in 1898 as principal landowners in Pavenham, although they continued to live at the Yews in Chellington until 1902. It's likely they moved to Pavenham soon afterwards though, as they both died there, Susanna in 1913 and Harriet in 1923. From 1903, the occupant was a Baptist minister, the Reverend Edwin Gorsuch Gange. He was born in 1844 and had been minister at the Broadmead Baptist Church in Bristol for 24 years. 2 memorial windows in his memory were placed there by his son, Edwin. By 1924, the unmarried William Reginald Battams, who had previously lived with his parents at Staysmore Manor House in Carlton, was in occupation. He died in 1925, which marked the end of the Battams era in Carlton. So entered William Ferry, the elder of John's 2 sons. 1928 is the first time the name Chellington House appears in records, when Captain Franklin lived here. Sometime after that, the house was altered internally by a later occupant who was an architect. Paul Wells of the Wells Brewers family occupied the house until 2006. Opposite Chellington House is number 6 Bridgend. This is an 18th century house with extensive alterations. The date stone on it reads 1706. Traditionally, it's been occupied by families of carpenters. One such carpenter was William Rudd, who was also a wheelwright. Later, Fred Brandon lived here. He was an undertaker. Before his marriage, he had served with the Royal Engineers during World War I, and in World War II he served in the Home Guard. He was a parish councillor of Carlton and Chellington for 10 years, and a church warden of St Mary's Church in Carlton. His younger son, Kenneth, became the owner of the business and the property in 1955. Although Kenneth was a carpenter by trade, leaving many examples of his handiwork in local churches, he was probably more well known as the local funeral director. He died in 2019 at the age of 90. It should be noted that this used to be a property with 2 gable ends. Historic aerial photographs showed that by the late 1940s the building to the right-hand side seemed to be of only 1 room depth. By 1968 it had been demolished. Alterations were made to the larger remaining dwelling in 1972. We're done with Chellington now, because if you set 1 foot onto the moor, you have officially crossed the old boundary into Carlton. Now, our first job in Carlton is to check out a huge set of allotments. This will send the fans into utopia today, let me tell you. Yeah, you Bedford folks won't know yet, will you? There's a running joke on this channel, which came about a few years ago, and it goes along the lines of, I have to find the allotments, if there are any, for the fans, because people do like to see these apparently for some odd reason. Well, check these out. These are massive. There are loads of allotments here. Huge, huge area. The fans will indeed be in utopia today. So here we are at the new school cum village hall on the moor. For a while, the old school on Bridge End operated in conjunction with a brand new school site here on the moor. This acted for a short while as an extension to the existing school. From 1975, therefore, Carlton became a split-site school. There were 2 classes at the moor and 2 at Bridge End. The moor site had a new kitchen, and so the Bridge End children walked down to the moor site every dinner time. The moor site would later gain a swimming pool. Before that, Robinson Pool in Bedford itself was used by the children here. The moor soon became the favoured location for everything, and so the old school building would close and be put up for sale. By 1978, 3 years after it was initially built, the entire school was run here from this new site, and so it remains today. This isn't just the school though, remember, it's also the village hall. What we've done now is use a footpath that links the moor to the causeway, and by doing that we've ended up at the playing field. It's a fair old size, this one. The locals know it as Carlton Park, and its main entrance is off Rectory Close. It features a playground, a small basketball court, a football pitch, and a 1.5 metre long slide. It also features one of the main landmarks of Carlton, its giant oak tree. Let's cross this towards the moor again, so that we can join the high street, where most of Carlton's best bits can be found. On the old maps we saw at the beginning of the video, the area between Carlton and Chellington was mostly fields. These days it's all been infilled with 20th century housing estates. Streets like Rectory Close, Carrier's Way, Street Close and Beebe Way are all less than 70 years old. Carlton and Chellington have always been, though, historically laid out in a rectangular road pattern. Bridge End and the High Street were always the main thoroughfares through each village, with the moor and the causeway making up the rectangle's other sides. Right, we're about to hit Carlton's High Street, so the other end of the rectangle, if you like. It's sort of a misshapen rectangle, it's not exactly, is it? But anyway, so here's the junction in front of us. That's the marsh to the right. It's a dead end. We're not going down that. There are some very historic and interesting Grade 2 listed buildings down there, but because it's a dead end, it makes more sense for us to turn left here. So we will, onto the High Street. Now, we're off to find number 26, which goes by the name Enchanted Cottage. The development of Carlton began principally in the High Street, which was nearest to both the church and the manor house. As such, it's where most of the oldest houses are to be found today. Here's one such house, known today as Enchanted Cottage. It's number 26. This is semi-detached to number 24 in an L shape, but brickworks and roofworks reveal that there was once another cottage between them, forming an L-shaped terrace. That terrace consisted of 4 cottages altogether. It's always interesting to see how things have changed. Here we have a former pub called the Angel. It's a 17th century building originally, but it has had a few alterations and extensions over the years. The earliest records of the place date back to 1702, when it was associated with the Rudds. At that time, it was known as Queen Anne Cottage. It became 2 cottages in 1726, and a separate maltings were added by 1824. The first record of the Angel being licensed as a pub dates from 1834, but it may have been used for that purpose before then. In 1805, the Northampton Mercury refers to an auction being held at the Angel Inn, Carlton. However, it is wholly possible there were 2 different properties with the same name, or that it closed for a time between 1805 and 1834. Trade directories of 1839 and 1847 give the occupant as Thomas Isles, who was a publican and a baker. The bakery was almost certainly next door. In 1876, the occupier was William Rudd and the owner William Ferguson of Milton Ernest. By 1891, it was owned by Hipwell and Company of Olney and became a tied house occupied by Thomas Jarvis. From 1903 until 1910, the landlord was William Smith. A later tenant, Charles Litchfield, supplemented the income from the pub by running a transport company from the large stone barn that then belonged to the Angel. He ran buses in competition with the already well-established Franklin's bus service. After the mid-1970s, there were a succession of short-lived tenancies, and in the 1980s the pub was sold to Banks's Brewery of Wolverhampton. Declining beer sales led to the private sale of the Angel, and it was de-licensed. It's been a private dwelling since 1994. The Fox, though, is still going. This is at number 35 High Street. The present pub began life as a farmhouse, and it's first referred to in a document from 1732. Interestingly, that same document called the High Street Carlton Street or Moor End Street. How names change, eh? By 1768 it was still a farmhouse, but soon afterwards it had been converted into a pub by or in association with Allen Church and or William White. The records aren't clear, but at least that tells us the names of the first 2 occupants of the Fox after its conversion. The Fox was owned for most of the 19th century by a successful family of Brewsters, the Lord family of Olney, but from 1876 to 1891 the owners were Hipwell and Company. After that it was Charles Wells Limited. The name of this pub is also of interest because it's linked to the other Fox Inn. At the coming of enclosure at the beginning of the 19th century, a new main road was created through Chellington, signalling the end of the old track between Harrold Bridge and Pavenham. That would have severely curtailed business at the Chellington Fox Inn, and so the Lords opened a new one. Now, I could walk through the Fox's car park in order to get to the next building, which you can actually see behind this little hut/garage type thing. It's a Baptist chapel just there, you see. However, there's something between here and there if we go around onto the causeway. It's a little memorial garden. Up the causeway we go now, and next we find the Memorial Park. In addition to this, there are 2 other sets of memorials in Carlton, one in St Mary's Church and the other in the foyer of Carlton Village Hall. They both carry the same number of names for both World Wars. Next we have the Baptist Chapel. In 1672, a farm in Carlton belonging to Gideon Fisher was licensed for congregational worship. It was one of the very few places licensed for worship in Bedfordshire at that time and was isolated from the rest of the village. Eventually, in 1760, meetings were able to move away from the barn at Fisher's Farm to a new chapel on the Causeway. It was built on land purchased from the Bithries, who lived at Fisher's Farm. In the 18th century, the original Georgian building seated 600 to 700 people. A man called Moses Beebe was the minister of the chapel between 1913 and his death in 1952. Many years elapsed before a new minister was appointed, and so numbers at Carlton Chapel declined, as they did in churches everywhere. By 1994, therefore, it had taken the decision to amalgamate with the old Harrold Evangelical Church to form the Grace Baptist Church, which we saw on Monday. It's housed in the old Mission Hall in Harrold High Street. Services in Carlton Chapel were reduced to just one a month. By the early 2000s, worship at Carlton ceased and the chapel was sold. It was converted to a private residence. Baptists from both villages still worship in Harrold today. Deceased members of the Baptist community had been buried in the churchyards of local churches. By 1830, though, Carlton's Baptists had acquired land for their own burial ground next to this chapel. The earliest graves in here date from 1830, and the last burial was made in 1991. When the chapel was sold, ownership of this burial ground was transferred to Carlton Parish Council. Believe it or not, this field on the right as we continue up the causeway is the village green. It doesn't look like your average one, does it? But apparently it is. Let's carry on to the top of this road, where we're about to meet a house with an equestrian past. Okay, now it's a case of just continuing up the causeway until we reach the junction where we started. Now, for the most part, the causeway is pretty much like what you can see right now. There's not many houses on it, to be honest with you, not really much to see. Until you get to the very top, that is, because there is a house on the right-hand side just before the junction, which is very interesting indeed. This is Jeddah House, a considerable 19th century building deemed of local interest, and here's why. It's a well-known story among the older inhabitants of Carlton that a former butcher called Frank Skevington made a lot of money through gambling on horses. Jeddah House exists thanks to that. He placed a bet on a horse called Jeddah who was running in the 1898 Derby. It wasn't fancied, the odds were 100 to 1, but despite that it won, and so did Frank. He and his wife Mary subsequently lived in Jeddah House, named after the horse. This house is distinguished by having a weathercock in the form of a racehorse on the former stable block and a memorial plaque with the inscription, "Won on the Turf." Frank died in 1915, aged 65, but Mary lived on to the age of 89, dying in 1936. Their only child, Edith, continued to live in Jeddah House until 1973. All three are commemorated in the churchyard at St Mary's in Carlton. Jeddah House has since been extended and modified now, and the old stable building is now residential. Okay, we are back on the causeway. No, we're not, we're on Bridge End. I've been walking around for that long, I forgot which roads are which. But then again, I've been doing this all morning, so it does get to you after a while. We're back on Bridge End after walking up the causeway. We're not quite done with this episode just yet. We now need to go down the causeway in the other direction to find Carlton's church, the site of Carlton Hall, and something called the Emmaus Village. Carlton's Church of St Mary is a long way out of the village to the south, just like Chellington's is to the north. This is much older than St Nicholas's though. In fact, the experts date this one back to 950 AD, more than 100 years before the Norman conquest, and therefore it's of Saxon origin. The bowl of the font here is Norman in character and dates from 1130. It's decorated with an early form of the Green Man motif in which grotesque heads and fleur-de-lis and scrolls are intermixed. The rope moulding around the upper part was damaged during Oliver Cromwell's time. Early masonry remains in the chancel and the tower, which may date from the latter part of the 11th or early 12th century. The tower is built of small flat stones like the chancel, but set in level courses. The same thing is to be seen in the tower of St Peter's Church in Bedford, also of a similar date. At some time in the 14th century, a chamber with a lean-to roof was built at the southwest corner against the tower and the wall of the south aisle. This was probably a priest's house, and the remains of a chimney can be seen outside at first floor level. The pointed chancel arch is very plain and of irregular shape, consisting of two chamfered orders which die into the walls. It too is perhaps of the 14th century. The rood screen, with 5 divisions of tracery, which would have supported a loft, is thought to be 15th century. Also a ways away from the village are the remains of Carlton Hall, which can be described as a moated enclosure. The monument includes the well-defined remains of a medieval moat with a 16th or maybe 17th century dovecote on its central island. The moated site is thought to mark the site of a park keeper's house dating to around 1312. Carlton Hall itself, which no longer stands, was a 16th century farmhouse which was built on or around the moated site. The exact site of Carlton Hall is unknown. The Reynolds family acquired Carlton Hall in the 1650s and stayed here until 1736, but despite that it's actually doubtful if the Reynolds ever lived in Carlton. We know they were present in Harrold because they lived at the mansion there. Carlton Hall was later sold to the executors of the Duke of Kent in 1764. By 1910, Lord Lucas owned much of the land in Carlton. The Lucas family sold its estates in Carlton, Harrold and Turvey, including land associated with the former Carlton Hall Manor. Now this last thing is, I think, one of the most interesting landmarks we've ever seen. Welcome to the Emmaus Village, located along a road called School Lane. The Emmaus Village is a community which includes a busy cafe and restaurant, a furniture repair workshop and second-hand shops. Also situated on the Emmaus site is Carlton Squash Club, a community-run club that offers 2 courts for both squash and racquetball. The courts were opened in 1980 by the former football manager Brian Clough, who himself was a keen squash player. So what exactly is the Emmaus Village? Well, let's explain, but to do that we first have to go back to 1857. We are currently on the site of a school, but it wasn't your normal run-of-the-mill primary or secondary. This was the Bedfordshire Reformatory School for boys. Despite the name, it was for boys from all over the country. Its location at that time was actually part of Turvey prior to parish boundary changes in April 1948. It was built on land owned by Mr. T.C. Higgins of Turvey House, the chairman of the Quarter Sessions and leading proponent of the scheme. So what did it do? Well, the premises were certified to accommodate 70 boys aged 13 to 15 who were committed by magistrates for a period of at least 4 years. It was primarily a farm school, with the boys being trained in agricultural work. From 1902 to 1924, the premises were improved and enlarged so that 115 boys could be accommodated. In 1911, it changed its name to the Carlton Reformatory School. Activities, as well as farming, soon expanded to include gardening, carpentry, engineering, and baking. The boys would often openly rebel against their treatment by staff. Indeed, the press widely publicised several incidents. Some of their accusations were justified, and the ensuing reports resulted in the recommendation of changes in the approved school system. This led in 1973 to the school becoming a community home with education under the control of Bedfordshire County Council. The majority of the original buildings were demolished at this time, and further reconstruction took place. The school, though, would close for good in the early 1980s. In 1984, St Margaret's Special School moved here from Great Gadsden in Hertfordshire, occupying the site until 1998. 3 years later, it too disappeared because in 2001 it became the site of the OMNIBUS village, where the ethos of support and training still lives on. The OMNIBUS village is designed for people who have experienced or have been at risk of homelessness. This is a place where they can enjoy companionship and support. In short, it offers them a home. Each person has their own bedroom whilst living in this community. In fact, with 42 rooms, this is the biggest homeless accommodation provider in Bedford Borough. When a companion wants to move on, they are assisted in finding accommodation and work too. The OMNIBUS village is open to all. It's well worth coming here to have a look at the shops. And so ends our first week in Bedford. That area has been absolutely amazing. When I first looked at the map, I thought these 5 didn't have much of anything, to be honest. How wrong I was about that. It's wonderful to see the histories of these places come to life. I'll be back to Bedford again soon, but it won't be this year. Stick around though if you're new, because you never know, even when I'm far away from Bedfordshire, I could still end up somewhere you know. See you soon, everyone. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.